Adrian, thank you so much for being there for us. You heard Daunte Wright's aunt in that piece. Well, she spoke with Don Lemon overnight and about the police department's explanation of her nephew's killing.
You don't mistake a stun gun from a gun. You don't mistake that. If I made a mistake like that, I'll be in the jail cell. They'll be trying to put me under it. This not fair. We got several police officers and all in our family. I don't have nothing bad to say about them, but what I got to say is she needs to pay for what she did to my family. My family's blood is on their hands. My brother and my sister is hurting. How do we put life back together after this? Some people say, oh, it's God's plan. That was not God's plan.
Joining us now, CNN political commentator and attorney Bakari Sellers, also with us Cheryl Dorsey. She's a retired Los Angeles police sergeant and author of Black and Blue, the creation of a social advocate. Friends, look, I know we will ask the question, how could a police officer make a mistake? Is that even possible? But Bakari, before you even get to that question, the fact of the matter is Daunte Wright is dead this morning. Daunte Wright is dead. And I just want you to reflect on what we saw yesterday, what we saw overnight, and the entire reaction and explanation to this point.
Yeah, that's a really good question, John. But it's more than just Daunte Wright is dead. It's, you know, a father is dead, a son is dead, a nephew is dead. You know, a young man who had, you know, 40, 50, 60 years in front of him is dead. And so, yeah, Daunte Wright's life was cut short for no reason. And even more importantly, when you peel back the layer of this onion, the frustrating part, if we're going to level set and keep it 100, John, as we always do, is white folk who want to say, well, why didn't he comply? Or he had misdemeanors. Where none of those things are death penalty crimes. I mean, we feel like we have to go through this over and over again. You lose Daunte, and then they try to sully his name in death. And you know, you think about what happened with our Army lieutenant, or you think about what happened with Tamir Rice. Even if you comply, or Philando Castile, you still don't get the same benefits that other people in this country get. And so, you know, this is a tough day, but I think that Ms. Dorsey will agree with me that I think one of the first emotions that most black people in this country feel today is just one of pure exhaustion.
Sergeant, to you, obviously the question is the one that John raised, which is how could that even happen? How could you shoot a gun and think it was a taser? But can we step before that? Why was such aggression used in the first place? When they pulled him over, even if there is an outstanding warrant, why such aggression from the beginning that escalated into this?
Because police officers, by and large, have come to learn that there is not a consequent commensurate with their bad act. The police chief is being intellectually dishonest and disingenuous when he tries to tell us that this was a mistake. This wasn't a mistake, it was murder. As a 20-year veteran patrol officer, I can promise you we handle our duty weapons daily to make sure that they're properly maintained as we put them in our holster for a number of reasons. And so it would be impossible almost to make that kind of a mistake, to not know your service weapon, your duty weapon from a taser. We know our weapons intimately, much like a mother knows her child's voice on a playground. And so I'm not buying any of this. They are trying to mitigate the civil liability that's coming.
You know, Bakari, you mentioned exhaustion, and I can hear it in your voice. I can hear the exhaustion in your voice. We are, you know, it's a year, not even a year, since the killing of George Floyd, 10 miles from where the trial is happening. And, you know, the question is, how could this be happening in the shadow of the trial less than a year after, when all these questions were raised then?
I mean, let me ask just a even different question. Like, you know, a lot of black folk have been saying this has been going on for a long period of time, but before body cameras, I mean, there are people who think that this just started happening with the emergence of body cameras, but ask how many of these things happened prior to body cameras? How many lives were lost because of quote unquote accidents? Now, I'm with Sergeant Dorsey here. It's an accident when you go to the Starbucks in the studio building and they put Jim Sciutto on your coffee instead of John Berman. Like, that's an accident. Like, you don't have an accident that ends up with a murder. That is just not something that happens when your taser and your service weapon are on different sides. I mean, we know the history of that confusion, or quote-unquote confusion, from Fruitville Station. And we know the changes and the adaptions that were made since then. But the question is, you know, when you have Derek Chauvin 10 miles away from where you have this officer murdering Daunte Wright, well, what are we teaching law enforcement? I mean, this is when you have people like me who push back on some of the fringes of my party and say that, you know, this is not an irredeemable, you know, police are not irredeemable. We have to reimagine what they should look like. And it's just so hard when you're going out here advocating for reforms that can save lives, when you quote unquote make mistakes like this. This is just unacceptable. And the police chief's response is intellectually dishonest, as Sergeant Dorsey said, and it's unacceptable as well.
Sergeant Dorsey, to the point that that Bakari just made, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib tweeted this overnight, and I'd like your reaction from the law enforcement position that you held for so long. She writes this: "It wasn't an accident. Policing in our country is inherently and intentionally racist. Daunte Wright was met with aggression and violence. I am done with those who condone government-funded murder. No more policing, incarceration, and militarization. It can't be reformed." What do you say to her this morning and all who agree with her?
Well, I'm in total agreement. And listen, I believe the only reform and training that police officers need going forward is a conviction, because they understand that when there's a penalty that's commiserate, equal to what they do, when they understand that, oh my God, there was an officer just a couple of counties over who's doing time right now for this very thing, maybe they would show a little impulse control. In the midst of all that's going on, officers still are not able to comport themselves in a way that's appropriate when they deal with black folks. We saw insurrectionists armed, and they weren't met with the kind of resistance that we see unarmed black men on a day-to-day basis being met with and then excused away with, oops, my bad.
Sergeant Dorr.
Aren't they? Because the weather forecast not very warm at all. Now, we're not likely to see much of a temperature climb at least the next several days. Let me show you this. Instead of that, we're looking at more snowflakes falling, coming in from the north, and you can see that spilling into North Dakota and southern Canada. So yeah, this is a system that's, I think you could look at it from this perspective. It's a good way to kind of
Now is sponsored by Billion Automotive.
Bad credit or no credit, but need a cop.
That they're going to sometime cooperate.
What happened on January 6th by
opinion on their profession, I would love to hear that. However, if your parent wants to come talk to me about how I'm not doing a good enough job in distance learning,
in the two. I mean, Willie, we're not going to litigate this here on the air, obviously. You just see the video and you hear her, and she says, "I'm going to taser you," and then she shouts, "Taser, taser, taser," which I believe is part of protocol to kind of warn a person or to let the officers next to her know that a taser is going to be used, and then she shoots. She seems shocked after the gunshot herself.
Yeah, I mean, she uses the expletive and said, "I shot him," clearly the moment after she discharged her weapon. Cedric, I'm curious to get your point of view on this. You've seen it all. You've led police departments. You've been an officer in Miami and Rochester and DeKalb County, the chief of police there. You've seen a lot. And I think this is an important point for people to understand. Is it standard protocol to have the taser on the opposite side? Was it standard protocol in the departments where you served and the departments you led? I guess the question is, for a lot of people watching this, how could an officer, even in the heat of the moment, given the weight, the size, the color, all the differences, make that mistake?
Well, I think there are a number of things that go on here, and certainly I'm not going to try to figure out what was going through her mind. But yes, the taser is usually kept on the weak side of your gun belt, and your firearm on the strong side. If you're right-handed, so your firearm will be on the right hand, your taser will be on the left hand. You know, I think part of the issue is here, guys, is there's a fear factor here. There's a preconceived notion somehow, and you can't help but think this, that whenever you pull over people of color, and you can go back to the lieutenant the other night there when he was pulled over, full military gear, but they focus in some officers, not all, some, focus in on color first, and whatever preconceived notions that we may have, consciously and unconsciously, come to bear. Because even if you think about the incident with the lieutenant when they pulled him over in the lighted location there, they got into this whole BLM thing. Well, it's hard for us, it's hard for you guys, we're in this BLM moment, bada bing, bada bang. That has nothing to do, should have nothing to do with the reason why he was stopped. And this young man who died, actually, he lives in that community. He jumps in the car because of bad police procedure, quite frankly, in handcuffing him with several officers on the scene. And he jumps in the car. He was going to take off. And you have to ask yourself, he can't be going anywhere but around the corner. He lives in the neighborhood. It's not like he's going to flee and go to Mexico. This kid is not going anywhere. He's there. So it's getting to a point where we're going to have to start to ask ourselves, and we all understand the challenges of policing. I certainly do. But we're going to have to begin to think about how we do things, and we got to do them different. And it's not just a training issue, to be perfectly honest with you. We got to evaluate our own selves and ask ourselves, are we truly being fair and balanced? And can we remove some of these preconceived notions that we have about people just merely based on their gender or their race or their sexual orientation or religious preference or whatever? That's the problem here. And we're going to continue to see these types of events because we can train people and train people and train people. But that is not the issue. The issue is, what is the spirit of your heart? How do you approach a neighborhood, a community, and people? And certainly folks who are not complying with police need to comply. But the problem in many communities of color, when we tell people to comply, such as the lieutenant, he did exactly what we train our children and family and loved ones to do if you're pulled over at night. But even when you comply, it somehow continues to turn south, and it continues to involve people of color. And I don't think that is being sensitive to the fact that it's people of color. Look at the data. Look at the reports that we see morning after morning after morning, day after day. And if you notice, they're beginning to run a lot closer together now than what we have seen in the past. But they're happening. It is an American issue that we're going to have to confront. We're going to have to deal with. There are thousands of good police officers right out there at this very moment attempting to do a great job. But it's those individuals who come to work who may have a different frame of mind about what they like and don't like, and it get played out on the street. It's not good for their departments, their city, or this country. And we need to make a self-assessment. All of us do, regardless of who we are, if we're in public service. A lot of great police officers out there who put it on the line for us every day, Joe, right here in Pensacola, right here in this community. Yes, great police officers. But we all, across this country, those of us that are in public service, that provide the welfare of people's safety, got to make sure we do our own self-evaluation. This is too far out of control.
Cedric Alexander, Thank you very much for being on the show this morning and for those words. As we've said, none of this took place in a vacuum, none of it. Yesterday was the last full day of testimony in the prosecution's case against former police officer Derek Chauvin, and it began with a defense motion to sequester the jury due to protests in the wake of the police shooting of Daunte Wright in nearby Brooklyn Center. With at least one juror having ties to the area, the defense argued the jury could be biased against Chauvin. Judge Cahill denied the motion. The jury then heard from expert cardiologist Jonathan Rich on whether drugs caused Floyd's death, and testimony from George Floyd's.
And I buy them too. So I just try to diversify what I'm giving my baby, and that way I know that he or she is getting everything.
Disdain for AOC and the squad, her unique message to the progressive group. We're going to tell you about that coming up next.
This development arising from a lawsuit filed by Nazario, who is a lieutenant again, and who is black and Hispanic. Body camera footage shows two police officers pointing their guns at him, then one pepper spraying him before pushing him to the ground during this traffic stop. This happened back in December. The officer said they believed that Nazario's SUV was missing a license plate and carried out a high-risk stop because their windows were tinted in this new car, and he delayed pulling over until he could find a well-lit area. Nazario's suit says exactly that. He was looking for a brightly lit spot to pull over. Police reports from the officer said Nazario was pepper sprayed because he failed to comply with their orders to get out of the car and struck one of the officers when he tried to unlock and open his doors. His lawsuit says those statements are false. There's no video evidence showing him striking the officers. This is some of the body camera footage of the officers drawing their guns at him. And Nazario's own cell phone video shows him with his hands up as ordered. We want to warn you, the video that we're about to roll is disturbing and hard to watch.
I'm honestly afraid to get out. Can I ask you what's going on?
Get out, now!
I have not committed any crimes.
You're being stopped for traffic violation. You're not cooperating at this point right now. You're under arrest for, you're being detained, okay? You're being detained for
For a
obstruction.
traffic violation, I do not have to get out the vehicle. You haven't even told me why I'm being stopped.
CNN has been unable to reach the fired officer, that's Officer Gutierrez. The other officer, Daniel Crocker, who to our knowledge has not been terminated, we haven't been able to reach him either or either of their representatives. With me now is Jonathan Arthur. He's the attorney representing Second Lieutenant Cara Nazario. Good morning. Thank you for getting up early to speak with us about this. I mean, you've known about this for months, obviously. This happened back in December, but the life of your client, the lieutenant, changed even more dramatically over the last 48 hours because now the world has seen what happened. How is he doing this morning?
I haven't spoken to him this morning. When I spoke to him yesterday, he was really, really grateful for all of the public outcry and support that he's received after his incident went viral. It's always a really daunting task, I think, when you wake up on a Saturday morning and one of the most terrifying moments of your life has gone viral. But the outpouring and support from the community and from our leaders, it's been a lot to him, so we thank you all.
We just mentioned what the Attorney General of Virginia is calling for, and that is the personnel records of both officers to be released. Have you seen them at all?
I have not.
When you talk about the basis of your case, you're basing it on the Supreme Court landmark decision in the 70s, Pennsylvania versus Mims, and that is what dictated the precedent for whether an underlying stop is unlawful and what subsequently happens after that. Can you explain to our viewers what it is that your client, the lieutenant, is hoping for here? Because clearly this is not just about monetary compensation cited in the suit. What does he want?
He wants this to stop. No sooner did my client's issues with the Windsor police go viral than there was another young man murdered for a traffic stop, for a traffic violation. My client's goal is to get this to stop. It has to stop. Our police need to be held accountable. They need to be retrained. These senseless murders must stop. This senseless violence has to end.
It sounds like your client is seeking, the lieutenant is seeking a conviction and not a settlement. Is that right? You want to see this through a jury trial?
So that's, yes, right, we want the precedent, as you were discussing, to hold other officers accountable. We want the deterrence effect that having a group of strangers from Virginia speak out and say this behavior is unacceptable. We need that set in stone. And for the preventative measures and for the deterrence against any other officers that may be inclined to behave like former Officer Gutierrez or current Officer Daniel Croker decided to behave.
Well, you bring up current Officer Daniel Crocker, and people will remember that in the video, near the end of that video, when the lieutenant says he is afraid to get out of his car to comply with the orders of the officers, it is Officer Crocker who responds, "You should be. You should be afraid."
It was Officer Gutierrez that said that.
Okay, thank you for that correction.
Croker, yeah.
Okay, thank you for that correction. My question to you is, have you had any indication as to why Officer Crocker is still with the police department or his standing in the police department, and importantly, what your client wants to happen to him?
So we haven't heard anything from the Windsor Police Department apart from this press release that they put out. Or I guess that may have been from the town of Windsor, so we don't know what Daniel Crocker's current status is. What does my client want from him? Well, everyone is equal under the law. So my client wants the law properly applied to Officer Croker. He's not above the law. He's there to uphold it, and it needs to be applied to him like it would be applied to everyone else.
Jonathan Arthur, the attorney for Second Lieutenant Karen Nazario, thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you for having us. We really appreciate it.
Ahead for us, the White House is rejecting Michigan's request for more vaccine doses. That puts the president at odds with one of his top Democratic allies, the governor of Michigan. We'll talk about the details and who had
to remain relatively cool. Here's that forecast for today. Afternoon highs in the 30s and 40s, a high of 44. In Sioux Falls, 42 degrees, an average
8 tomorrow. Slight chance for a little bit of rain coming up Thursday and again on Friday with highs in the upper 40s, but we see both Sunday and again Monday out in Pierre, Thor.
All right, thanks, sir. And criticizes. Just real quick, she also going to take on Mitch McConnell. He says he is not a force for good in the country. He's an enabler of some of the worst stuff. And
see video from a previous arrest of Mr. Floyd, where just like in 2020 and 2019, right before the cops get him, he consumes drugs. And we'll hear testimony that in 2019, he told a medic that he had 9 Percocet pills that day. Again, it's putting the victim on trial. It's a little sleazy, but sometimes it works. Again, all the defense has to do is to create a suggestion in one juror's mind that maybe it was the drugs that killed Mr. Floyd and not the knee on Mr. Floyd's neck.
Paul Butler, thank you very much for your analysis this morning. An update now on the traffic stop in Virginia of Second Lieutenant Karen Nazario, what we told you about yesterday. The Virginia Attorney General's office has asked the Windsor Police for personnel records of the 2 officers involved in the incident and all use of force records for the past 10 years. According to the Virginian pilot, the AG also wants access to various complaints against the department that involve traffic stops, use of force, and treatment on the basis of race, color, and/or national origin. The probe comes after Lieutenant Nazario sued the police force, accusing them of violating his civil rights during a December encounter. Video of the incident was released over the weekend by Nazario's lawyer and went viral, sparking internal investigation calls from the governor.
Get out of the car! Get out of the car now! What's going on? You're fixing to ride the lightning, son. Get out the car! You received an order. Obey it. I'm honestly afraid to get out. Can I? Yeah, you should be.
The Sergeant Major of the Army yesterday tweeted his support of Lieutenant Nazario, quote, "He represented himself and our Army well through his calm, professional response to the situation. I'm very proud of him." Willie.
So Gene Robinson, Lieutenant Nazario, had temporary plates taped to the inside window of his car. The officers pulled him over because they didn't see permanent plates on the car. It was a new vehicle. But we got a couple of windows into what it's like to be a person of color in these traffic stops when he said, "I'm honestly afraid to get out." The officer said, "You should be." And in the case of Daunte Wright, when he was getting pulled over, he called his mother, which I thought was very telling. When I get pulled over, if I get pulled over for speeding, it's never once crossed my mind to call my mother. He called his mom, who reminded him to put his hands on the steering wheel. It's a conversation we've talked to you about over the last several years with your own children. Two very stark windows into what it's like inside these vehicles in these moments.
Yeah, you're, you know, one of the witnesses, I think it was Mr. McMillan in the George Floyd trial, testified to having yelled at George Floyd when the police officers put their hands on him, "You can't win." And that's a situation. You driving while black, you can't win. Lieutenant Nazario did everything right. Everything he should have done, and yet there are those two officers with their handguns drawn, pointed at him for reasons that he has no ability to even comprehend, to even understand. Why is this happening? Why are black men, more often than not, black men approached, especially in these traffic stop situations, with this level 10 of force immediately that escalates the situation. And fortunately, in the case of Lieutenant Nazario, because he was so calm and so even, that did not end in tragedy, but it could have, over literally nothing, over missing plates that weren't missing. But even, of course, if they were missing, who could get plates the last year? Because DMVs have been closed, including the DMV in Virginia was closed for months and months and months. But that doesn't even apply in this case. That's not even a factor. There was absolutely no reason for him to have been stopped. But the officers could not acknowledge their error, right? It's as if once they start, they have to dominate. They have to subdue this black man in a way that humiliates him. It is. You know, it's an old story. It's an old story of racism in this country. It's 400 years old, but it's got to stop, because we're just not going to take this anymore. This has got to stop.
We're going to continue following this and continue this conversation, which is much needed. We want to turn to politics now. President Joe Biden hosted an Oval Office meeting with a group of...
Donna, Jason, we've all tragically been on the air together for too many of these conversations. And so I just want to ask you first, Donna, what are your thoughts today on this story, achingly similar, with all the structural problems really in place that we talk about every single time a family has to publicly grieve, like Daunte's family had to do today?
Yeah, you know, Nicole, as I was listening to the pain and feeling the pain of this mom and aunt, and you know, hearing their pain that we've heard so many times before. And you know, a friend of mine wrote me last night that how dare she have the audacity to be a black woman giving birth to black male children in this world. And I feel that same audacity and vanity given what we all see too many times in America, and wondering how and when it's going to change. I don't know that I have an answer for that, even as we're in the midst of the Derek Chauvin trial, just miles away from Brooklyn, center. And so it is that pain that takes away something from each one of us, not to mention the pain of that one grieving family.
And very much along those lines, Jason, I read your Twitter feed, and I'm going to let you hold forth, but let me just put out there for our viewers a statement from the President and Mrs. Obama. They put out this today. Our hearts are heavy over yet another shooting of a black man, Daunte Wright, at the hands of police. The fact that this could happen, even as the city of Minneapolis is going through the trial of Derek Chauvin and reliving the heart-wrenching murder of George Floyd, indicates not just how important it is to conduct a full and transparent investigation, but also just how badly we need to reimagine policing and public safety in this country. Jason?
I've been saying we need to abolish American policing as it currently exists. It doesn't work. And we don't seem to have this sort of difficulty when we're talking about any other government agency. So, Nicole, I teach my class of Morgan State students before this. We were having this discussion with a bunch of 19 and 20-year-olds. And I pointed out to them, I said, what's the graduation rate for high school kids in Baltimore? And the Baltimore graduation rate is only about 80%. People are always screaming, oh my gosh, Baltimore public schools are terrible. They need to be taken over by the state. They need to be taken over by the government. Only 80% of these kids graduate. You know the average homicides that are actually solved by police departments? Only about 35%. You know the number of rapes and sexual assaults that are solved by police departments? Less than 60%. You know the percentage likelihood of being shot unarmed as a black person is like 5 times as likely than a white person? Policing doesn't work the way we're doing it right now. And if we had that level of endemic failure in any other government agency, every politician in America would say, not just reimagine, we need to tear this down to the studs and rebuild it. And anything less than that is absolute gaslighting to the tears that this woman was expressing. I am tired of people saying this is a tragedy. We've known it was a tragedy. And no one's doing anything about it. And whether it's a mass shooting in a public school or another black man or another black woman, and I promise you, Nicole, because before this trial is over, I said this when the Derek Chauvin trial began. I was like, we're going to have another shooting before this trial is over. And we have one. If the trial goes another 2 weeks, we'll have another shooting. So we need to start thinking of a different way to approach policing. And if we don't have that conversation, then no one cares about crying tears and no one cares about blood in the streets, because anything else is just window dressing.
Is in fact the best witness for the prosecution, because if you recall, Officer McKenzie said, yeah, you can be distracted by the crowd. That can change what happens with the medical condition, but this witness is essentially saying, no, you are responsible for de-escalating the situation if the person starts to fall off. And we haven't even gotten yet, Mike, to the 3 minutes where Mr. Floyd is not even moving. This was the most disastrous witness the defense could have called. Point that my colleagues are making, I made the same note. 60 hours only, $11,000 in payments. He didn't review all of discovery. That's textbook 101. You don't put your witness in the position of not having had all the information, and definitely was not properly prepared for trial. This is like such malfeasance, but nevertheless, this is the best use of force expert the state has had on the stand, and it was handed on a silver platter by the defendant.
Wow, and he's not finished. I mean, you saw the look on Schlitzer's face like, let's just take a break. I mean, it's like a boxer who's just toying with an opponent. At least that's the way it looks here. Ariva, give us your thoughts. You're hearing your colleagues.
Yeah, I was, before we went back into trial, I was telling you, and it's come up on the screen, this witness testified for an officer in the shooting death of Laquan McDonald in Chicago, a 17-year-old that was shot by police officers. The officer lied, he covered up, it was a horrible case for the Chicago Police Department, and this was the expert witness for that officer, and that officer was convicted of murdering Laquan McDonald. So that's some history about this expert. I talk a lot, Mike, about trials being stories, about this being theater. So when the jurors compare this witness who's been combative, he's been defensive, he hasn't, looked at the jury very much, he hasn't tried to endear himself to this jury at all. When they compare him to Steiger, when they compare him to that law professor that we saw yesterday, all of whom were looking directly at the jury, were engaging with the jury, their testimony was clearly resonating based on what the pool reporter's notes are coming back to us. This witness has done nothing to advance the case for the defense. And quite frankly, let's be real here. This is an indefensible case on so many levels. So he's working with it, the best he can. And let's give him that benefit of the doubt, but poorly prepared and poorly, executing on the stand.
Real quick, Joseph Scott Morgan, weigh in.
Yeah, I'm still having a hard time getting past this idea of the confined space and explaining this, why these 4 grown men could not just pick George Floyd up and move him to another location. I don't think this idea of safety holds any water. I mean, if you look at the freeze frame image from where they had Mr. Floyd positioned, he's in the middle of the road already. Why not pick him up and move him to another location? I can't wait to hear if the prosecution is going to explore this with him, because it just doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
No, and one other point, and I think he's going to get there further, is back to the in your custody, in your care. You should have an awareness of a medical condition. Loss of consciousness, ability to breathe, no pulse. He's going to go back there for sure. All right, we want to take a break, guys? Okay, let's take a quick break. You're not going to miss a moment of this testimony, this continued cross-examination. You're watching HLN's continuing coverage of the Derek Chauvin trial. Keep it here.
Severe type of blood clot reported in 6 of more than the 7.2 million people in the U.S. who have been given the shot. All 6 cases occurring among women between the ages of 18 and 48, within 6 to 13 days after injection, and including 1 death. Health experts expected a small number of complications. This type of clot wasn't among them.
I think what people need to be is...
Quick Stop is discounted to only 9.
That recovery can be stymied if regulators impose inappropriate, burdensome regulations. Laws and securities regulations are not the appropriate vehicle.
What? We've got self-driving cars.
Maybe happening right. Country that we don't see. This was precisely the opposite of the de-escalation that we've all been talking about over these last couple of years. There is now an investigation coming out of both the state police and the Attorney General's office in Virginia. But also, I think that the Department of Justice has to get really re-engaged again about looking at pattern and practice investigations of police departments across the country. And as we can see, Windsor, Virginia, a very small police department, Minneapolis, larger, Brooklyn Center in between. It doesn't matter the size of the department. It apparently doesn't even matter the training because the training is violated so much. So, I mean, I point to Maryland, my home state, which over this last week passed very sweeping reforms in criminal justice and in policing. And it's the first state to really do so at that level. And we still have a lot of work to do to make sure that these incidents don't happen again. But to Jason's point, it's so widespread that it is inevitable until we get control over it.
Jason, I'll give you the last word.
There is a process that the federal government can engage in right now. They can collect some of the data which was started in the Obama administration, slowed in the Trump administration, use of force. They can make an assessment of use of force. Departments that appear to have too much use of force, you strengthen consent decrees. You come in, you say these people who have engaged in this behavior, you will lose all of your federal funding if these people are not fired. This is a breakdown as to what this police department does on a regular basis. You're only dealing with violent crime 15% of the time, so you only need to have 15% of your force officers prepared for that. The rest of this is traffic stuff. Increase the number of cops who handle traffic. They don't necessarily have to have guns. Increase the amount of social workers that you have so that you don't have cops negotiating domestic violence instances. There are plans out there. There are things the federal government can do. This is a lack of will on the part of an administration, not a lack of ideas and not a lack of resources.
Carmen Bass, thank you for being part of this conversation and starting us off this hour. We're grateful for you. Donna and Jason are sticking around. When we come back, a sudden setback to the nation's vaccine efforts.
Particular situation, why is it your view that it's objectively reasonable? Right after he stops talking, why is that objectively reasonable? 3 minutes later, with the knee on the neck, talk to us about that and your legal conclusion as to that. And so I think the problem is that you want to the extent possible, lay an adequate foundation so there's less cleanup to do. At this point, you know, you're just sitting in your chair saying, oh my goodness, I think there could have been a lot done prior to this, and that's the problem.
Well, it sounds like, and Bob, weigh in on this, what Joey said is the way it should have gone on direct. You should have walked in through specifically and not in generalities.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mike, I've been trying to bring this point up, but it never really has come up to its importance until right now. Let's go to the civil complaint that was filed by Mr. Crump and the civil attorneys. And I know we have civil rights litigators on the show, of which I was one too. They point to the fact that the Minneapolis Police Department, their training, their policies, their statistics, it is so well sourced here that in a couple of year period, there were 100 or 428 people that were had the neck restrained. How many people got injured? And that regardless of what the policies say, this is what the practice is on the street, and that they should know that. So what he should be doing, Nelson, is trying to say Derek, the defendant rather, Chauvin, is the creature of the police department, the improper training. Look at all these instances. What he thought he was doing was the right thing. It wasn't his intent to actually assault the man. That's what they trained him to do. But I thought that expert was going to get into what's in this civil complaint because it's a scathing indictment of the Minneapolis Police Department. Instead, we got the defense's expert saying, contrary to some testimony that came out from the state's experts, that you must constantly be reevaluating the medical condition, and irrespective of what's going on around you, you are responsible for de-escalating. And Mike, we haven't even gotten to 3 minutes.
No, that's still to come. Court's back in session. Let's listen in.
Thank you, Your Honor. And sir, I'm going to ask you some questions just to see if we can skip through some of the video as well. You would acknowledge, you testified about the bystanders.
Each style includes maximum ultra-go cushioning. Skechers Air.
Many advanced him to the full Senate.
It's hard to believe.
Every day to keep you healthy.
Young man was not following direction. Did it warrant even the use of a taser at that point? So that's question one. And then instead we go to a firearm. Tragic situation involving that 20-year-old Daunte Wright. Prayers go out to his family. But certainly that officer does have the right to due process, and I know that was an issue for some But what's good for the community is certainly good for the men and women. And being transparent, being coordinated, giving assurance to the community, and building a trust-based relationship are all the things that work in local government's favor.
You would publish that, please.
I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe.
And at that time, then you see the camera had panned out into the street, and there was the one gentleman that you referred to, correct?
Yes.
And did he appear to be saying anything?
Not that I heard, no.
Doing anything?
No.
Threatening?
Didn't appear to be, no.
Major risk factor?
No.
And during that period of time, you heard Mr. Floyd repeating that he can't breathe, correct?
Yes.
And so a reasonable officer in the defendant's position at that time shouldn't have been at least distracted by Mr. McMillan. Fair?
Yeah, that's fair.
Okay. Now, if we could go to a little bit forward, take a look at Exhibit 127, starting at 2021-28. And we'll play that through 2021-59.
I can't breathe. You're doing fine. You're talking fine. Yeah, let me breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I'm about to die in the face. Relax. I can't breathe my face. Just get up. Go on. Go on. What do you want? I can't breathe. Please, the knee in my dick. I can't breathe shit. Get up.
All right, and so, sir, at this point, the clip that we just heard, the restraint is continued, fair?
Yes.
Great. And this then, as he's talking, you can hear Mr. Floyd at least expressing that he's in some kind of distress, fair?
Yes.
Indicating that he can't breathe.
That's what he's saying.
And of course, the defendant is on top of him, true?
Yes.
And so in the context here, that might be a reasonable police officer might tend to believe him, correct?
I'm sorry, believe
Mr. Floyd.
That he
He's
can't
saying
breathe.
he can't breathe, and the defendant is on top of him on hard pavement. In that context, a reasonable police officer might tend to lend that some more credibility than, say, if he was shouting it from across the street at normal tones.
It's possible.
And at this point, did you see anyone, any bystanders in the crowd?
The clip really wasn't showing much. I did see two people look like Officer Tao engage with one person, telling him to get back on the sidewalk.
Well, let's take a look at around the same time, which is Tao's body-worn camera, which is marked as Exhibit 49 at 2021-18. Be about 10 seconds earlier than the clip I just showed you. If we could play that, please.
Please, man, relax. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I'm about to die in the face. Relax. Man, I can't breathe my face. Just get up. What do you want? I can't breathe. Please, the knee in my dick. I can't breathe shit. Get up, get in the car.
All right, and so where we ended, we just heard that would have been the 61-year-old Charles McMillan saying something to the effect of "get up and get in the car," right?
Okay, I heard that.
All right, and then you saw some other bystanders, correct?
Yes.
And those bystanders appeared to be a ways away from Officer Tao, correct?
On the sidewalk, yes.
On the sidewalk, and they were a couple of teenage girls, correct?
I saw one woman, I thought I saw a man, and they're both recording.
Recording? There was someone in a hooded shirt with a phone, correct?
Yes.
All right. And then there was someone who was in a white t-shirt on the phone?
Yes.
And did they appear to be saying anything?
No.
And so it would be fair to say that the people on the sidewalk at that point wouldn't have been doing anything that could have been distracting a reasonable police officer at the scene, correct?
At that point, yes.
That people don't want this vaccine. And at the same time, I've got 20-year-olds in the hospital. So I think that this is a gut blow. And I think it reinforces something we've talked about, that we have had so much misinformation, such a lack of credibility in the science. Anybody who is concerned or curious will be watching tomorrow as the CDC is covering this. And we want to bring those conversations transparently to light. And that's the most important thing we can do. If anything we've learned through January 6th and everything that's happened this past year, we need more of these conversations to be public and to look at the facts. And that's exactly what we're going to do. And that means the fact is, if you're not vaccinated, you are that much more likely to be susceptible to getting COVID. And you have a much higher risk of having all of these bad events.
COVID test, you need a passport. And illegal right now just crosses, they get apprehended and they're processed and released into our country. But here's the kicker. We just found out, and the state of New York just passed a bill allocating $2.1 billion for illegal immigrants. If you are an illegal, undocumented, unemployed immigrant in New York, you're eligible for up to a $15,600 check per app.
Dinan, he is politics editor for the Washington Times.
As you say that Donald Trump pushed a, quote, bullshit lie that the election was stolen, and then you note he incited the insurrection on January 6th for nothing more than, quote, selfish reasons. What was your reaction when you saw House members you once worked with, people you probably considered friends, such as current House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy, pushing the big lie on the airwaves in that crazy Texas lawsuit, then on the floor of the House? What did you think when you saw them doing it?
Well, I just kept waiting for evidence to show up. The president was out there every day talking about the election being stolen. They're filing lawsuits. I'm waiting for the evidence. And sadly, no evidence ever showed up. And I think the president abused the loyalty and trust that his voters had placed in him by not being honest with the American people about the outcome.
He clearly did, but he wasn't alone. And Kevin McCarthy, he voted to object to the election even after the attack on the Capitol with, blood on the floor, along with 146 other Republicans. And then McCarthy went down to Mar-a-Lago, met with President Trump days later. What message do you think that sends to the House Republicans?
Well, I don't know. I'm not there anymore. I don't serve in the caucus. It's hard for me to be critical. I spent 40 years around politics. I thought I knew something about it. But clearly these days, I don't know much.
But if you're willing to criticize Trump for pushing a lie, why would you not be willing to criticize Kevin McCarthy for doing the same thing? He went on Fox News 2 days after the election and said, quote, President Trump won this election. So everyone who's listening, do not be quiet. He was playing to the crowd, which is something that you criticize politicians for very well in your book. playing to the crowd on conservative media. Isn't your successor, Kevin McCarthy, doing that too?
Well, listen, he's responsible for what he's got to say. I don't need to comment.
When you were Speaker, you eliminated earmarks, these sweetheart deals for members of Congress for their district that don't go through the normal appropriations process.
I'd like to take you then to Exhibit 49 starting, at 2022-22, which is going to be overlapping the period we just saw. I'll just start it and I'd like you to pause it right away. 2022-22. All right, if you could hit play, and I'll tell you when to pause. Stop. Okay. And so now at this point in time, you see bystanders, correct?
Yes.
And you would acknowledge that they're not in the street, correct?
Correct.
They're on the sidewalk.
Yes.
Right? They're holding cell phones.
Yes.
Right? These are the two teenage girls I was talking about.
Okay.
This is the elderly gentleman I was talking about, Mr. McMillan.
Okay.
All right. They don't appear to be doing anything threatening at that point, do they?
No.
They don't appear to be making any noise at all at this point, do they?
Not that I could hear, no.
And certainly would not have distracted the defendant.
That I can't say.
Well, they're not doing anything and they're not saying anything, so would a reasonable police officer in the defendant's position have been distracted by their non-action?
I think he could have been aware of their presence and maybe start to plan for it.
Okay, but you see in this, at 2022-27, at least he's looking down at Mr. Floyd, he's talking to Mr. Floyd, at least acknowledging what Mr. Floyd is saying, right? And so while it's possible he could have potentially been aware of them, it doesn't appear he was from at least what we just saw here. True?
Not from this snippet, no.
All right, let's move ahead again then. In Exhibit 43, starting at 2023-38. If you could publish that, please. Stop. All right, now at that point you could hear somebody in the background, correct?
Yes.
You heard Mr. Floyd, true?
Yes.
His voice appeared slower than before?
Possibly.
Thicker than before?
In what?
Thicker?
Yes.
Right. You also heard conversation, normal tone conversation between Officer Lane and the defendant, correct?
Yes.
Officer Lane said, roll him on his side, right?
Yes.
And what was the defendant's response?
Something not yet.
No, keep him here.
Okay.
Right? And so, at this point, Officer Lane is suggesting that they roll him on his side. Would that be consistent with the side recovery position?
Yes.
Okay. And the defendant is rejecting the side recovery position at this point. True?
Yes.
He's hearing his information from his fellow officer, deciding a different course of action. Nothing the crowd's doing is preventing them from having that conversation. Is that right?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
And in your view of the clip that we just looked at, just focusing on the subject behavior, what is Mr. Floyd doing? What was he doing in that clip?
He's becoming more compliant.
Well, is there any non-compliance you were able to see in that clip?
In this clip, no.
And so he's not exhibiting non-compliance, and based on your testimony and your review and the plain video record in front of you, you see that the defendant has not changed his position, correct?
Correct.
He's still applying the same level of force that he did at the beginning of the restraint period, true?
That I can't say.
He's still kneeling on Mr. Floyd, correct?
Yes.
And you're not contending this was some sort of an accidental position, right? He didn't fall down onto Mr. Floyd. He was purposefully kneeling on him.
Yes.
True? Okay. All right. And so, based on your view, right, of the defendant being on top of Mr. Floyd, up to this point and beyond this point, the defendant did not alter the level of force that he was using on Mr. Floyd, did he?
No.
Even though Mr. Floyd, by this point, had become, as you put, compliant. Fair?
More compliant, yes.
Well, what part of this is not compliant?
So I see his arm position in the picture that's posted.
Right.
That, you know, a compliant person would have both their hands in the small of their back and just be resting comfortably, versus like he's still moving around.
Did you say resting comfortably?
Or laying comfortably?
Resting comfortably on the pavement.
Yes.
At this point in time, when he's attempting to breathe by shoving his shoulder into the pavement.
I was describing what the signs of a perfectly compliant person would be.
So attempting to breathe while restrained is being slightly non-compliant?
No.
No. You're aware, if we could take a look at Tao's body-worn camera starting Exhibit 49 at 2023-38. And at this point, you see this Tao's body-worn camera, we see more people here, correct?
Yes.
Right. You still see the teenage girl with the cell phone?
Yes.
She's joined by what appears to be a juvenile female, correct?
Yes.
Wearing a love shirt?
Yes.
Right. Another teenager filming, is that right? And you see that?
Yes.
And then there's an individual in a hooded sweatshirt standing on the sidewalk, correct?
Yes.
All right, if you could play that.
We're done. You circle. Okay, like in the jiu-jitsu move, bro. You try to do this breathing right there, bro. Okay. You don't think that what it is? You don't think nobody understands that shit right there, bro? I trained at the academy, bro. That's some bullshit, bro. You did. Okay. Right. And you understand? Bullshit, bro. All right. That's bullshit, bro. You fucking stopping his breathing right there, bro. Okay, he's talking.
Okay, well, you heard Mr. Tao say he's talking, correct?
Yes.
Referring to Mr. Floyd, right?
Yes.
I guess he was talking, wasn't he?
Yes.
And he said, I can't breathe, right?
Yes.
And it was even more slow at this point, correct?
Could have been.
And this is well within the restraint period, true?
Yes.
And the individuals here, in terms of the volume you're hearing, you don't hear this person saying anything, do you?
No.
Or her?
No.
Or her?
No.
Or him?
No.
Or him?
I'm not sure of that.
The gentleman in the blue shirt with the baseball cap.
No, didn't hear him say anything.
Didn't hear the guy behind the person in the hooded sweatshirt say anything, the plaid shirt there?
I didn't hear him, no.
Okay, and so the only person that you would have heard say anything is the person in the hooded sweatshirt, correct?
Yes.
And what was he saying?
Something about get off him, bro. You don't teach that in the academy. You don't learn in the academy.
He said you're cutting off his breathing, right?
Okay.
Fair to say he was expressing concern?
Yes.
And in this moment, was this crowd a threatening crowd?
No.
All right, I'm going to take you to Exhibit 127 at 2024-18. Please publish that.
In the car right now, bro. You're not resisting arrest or nothing. You enjoying it. Look at you. Your body language is crazy. You fucking bum.
It's the whites. They love
What?
women.
Yeah, I already know that, bro. I trained with half of these bum ass dudes at the academy, bro. You know that's bogus right now, bro. You know he's vocal. You can't even look at me like a man because you're a bum, bro. He's not even resisting arrest right now, bro.
His nose is bleeding.
He's fucking stopping his breathing right now, bro. You think that's cool? You think that?
Okay. During that time period, and I don't know if you heard, did you hear another officer, did you hear the voice of Officer Lane say he's passing out?
I didn't hear that, no.
Did you hear Mr. Lane say that at any point in your analysis of these videos before you came to court today?
About what Mr. Late or Officer Late said?
That's correct.
Yes.
And so you heard him say, at least one occasion, he's passing out, correct?
Yes.
And would you accept my representation that that would have occurred around this time during this clip?
Yes.
All right. And other people, bystanders, are saying the same thing, correct?
I heard mostly just what the one gentleman was saying about being a bum and not resisting arrest and things like that.
Right. That the defendant was being a bum and that Mr. Floyd was not resisting arrest, correct?
Yes.
And you just saw the video. You saw Mr. Floyd, what he was doing at that time. At that time, would you agree, and I'll tell you the name of the person, it's Donald Williams. Would you agree with Donald Williams that Mr. Floyd was not resisting arrest at that moment?
Yes.
Mr. Floyd doesn't appear to be conscious at the end of this clip, does he?
I can't tell.
And you're certainly not as close to him as the defendant was in that moment, correct?
Correct.
He's not talking, correct?
Yes.
He's not resisting.
Doesn't appear to be, no.
And from this point forward, the defendant remains on top of him in the same position as when he started the restraint period. Isn't that true?
I would say the same general position. I wouldn't say the same exact position.
Same exact position, same general position. The position is such that he's on top of him, compressing his lungs, compressing his chest against the pavement, right? With his body weight.
It's in a prone control position.
In a restraint. He's restraining, correct?
Yes.
Can't move, right?
Floyd can't move?
Floyd can't move.
No.
He's not moving. He's not resisting. He's not talking. It's not possible, is it?
To do what?
Resist.
I think it's definitely possible to resist.
When you've passed out. He's not doing it here, is he?
Not when he's passed out, no.
When we talk about what's possible, let's talk about what's happening in this case. He's not resisting, is he?
And in this snippet, no.
Right. And from this point forward, right? From this point until the point at which the EMTs arrive and tap on the defendant's shoulder and take Mr. Floyd and place him onto the gurney. From this point to that point, Mr. Floyd wasn't resisting, was he?
No.
The defendant maintained the same general position.
Yes.
Force must be reasonable at the start of the force, correct?
Yes.
Throughout the continuation of the force and at the end of the force, correct?
Yes.
And you reviewed these videos and you understand that by the time the defendant got off of Mr. Floyd literally could not support his own head. Did you see that?
Yes.
Did you see the way he moved, the way his head moved when they moved onto the gurney?
I did.
And a reasonable police officer in the position of the defendant, and that position is the position we see here, on top of him, would know that, right?
Would know
that he's not responsive, that he's not resisting.
I think he would know he's not resisting.
Because the officer said that he wasn't breathing. Said that to the defendant, right?
The officer did, or what the
Mr. Lane. Mr. Lane said that.
Rephrase, because I got lost.
I'm sorry. Mr. Lane said that. Mr. Lane said that to the defendant in the prior clip we watched, that he's not breathing, right?
Well, I heard that he's passed out. I didn't hear the not breathing part.
Well, the passed out came from the bystander, right?
I'm not sure.
Did you hear at some point in your review Officer King say that he couldn't find a pulse?
Yes.
All of this would have been known to a reasonable officer in the defendant's position, correct?
Yes.
And the defendant's position is and was and remains, as we see here at this moment, in this time, in this clip, on top of Mr. Floyd, on the street. Isn't that right?
Yes.
I have nothing further.
To truly
Other Republicans added means to criticize that everything by your definition would be infrastructure. Do you ever regret saying that?
No, not at all. But let me explain to your viewers. So we know that if you have a company that wants to ship goods, things like rail lines and roads are infrastructure. But if you don't have childcare, if you don't have the ability to look after kids when they should be in school but aren't because they're home because of COVID, you don't have the infrastructure you need around you to get to work. So the care economy is what we could call soft infrastructure. You've got the hard infrastructure of roads, bridges, broadband. You know, broadband wasn't considered infrastructure 100 years ago because it didn't exist. And so it matters what we define as infrastructure as what's necessary to get the economy moving. And if you don't have access to daycare, universal pre-K, affordable daycare, or a national paid leave plan, it's going to be really hard to get families back to work. And we need them back to work. We need this country to be thriving.
No, I certainly understand where you're coming from. Do you think that if that a narrative that Republicans seized on, though, to say, see, this is all about using this as an excuse for Democrats to spend.
And then the answer is no. And if they don't know how important it is, they should ask their wives, because I'm sure they know how important it is. A lot of care gets given to women in families, and unfortunately, during COVID, women disproportionately bore the brunt of this pandemic. In fact, in the month of December, there was 140,000 net jobs lost. And if you add up all the jobs gained by men and women, all the jobs lost by men and women, it was net 140,000 women who lost those jobs. And largely, they were women of color. So this pandemic has hit different demographics differently. And I think until this country recognizes things like the care economy is part of infrastructure, it'll never fully recover. I think we have to understand that it's critical infrastructure. Just like in a pandemic, we finally realized.
Senator, I'm sorry, but I did want to get clear. How do you feel about Joe Biden apparently is open to negotiating that tax hike? I know your colleague, Joe Manchin in West Virginia, doesn't want a 28% corporate tax rate, more like 25%. Where are you on this?
I support it. I think the Trump tax cuts for the ultra wealthy and businesses was irresponsible, and I fully support repealing those parts of the tax cuts.
Seeing fascism as a broad worldview, that
cancer while fighting the VA. I can't even imagine how horrible this has been for you and your family.
It's actually a fight that I've taken on after his passing, because we did not know until only a few months before he passed that this was an issue. And I've actually come to find the pictures, thankfully, through some of the men that served with him, and they sent it to me because they don't even know that it's an issue. And that's where one of the things that I have a problem with is the lack of knowledge, the lack of tracking, the lack of informing these people so they could be proactive instead of reactive. There's no difference between what he slept near for 6 months and what we were near on 9/11. Ground zero. It's the same toxins.
And John, you accomplished this before. Your celebrity name helped these 9/11 victims who suffered very similar, if not the exact same respiratory illnesses at Ground Zero, and you were in the fight of your life for that. Is that experience helping you at all in this fight for military veterans and burn pits?
I think helping to recognize sort of the failings of the system and maybe a blueprint for pushing through some of the bureaucratic inertia that fights against this. It's unconscionable that Gina and her family, after being put through such a devastating trial with her husband passing, is forced to fight against the very government that her husband signed to protect and defend. It doesn't make any sense. And the only drawback is they always talk about, well, can we pay for it? Whenever you're up there, they say, well, geez, should we include that disease? They know what diseases are caused by exposure to these toxins. It's why it's illegal to do this in the United States. So it comes down to money. And I think our point of this is the cost of war. Everybody says, well, freedom isn't free. Right. It costs this amount of money, and you've got to pay for the consequences of the service that they faced in dangerous theaters.
John Stewart, Gina Cancelino, Isabel Cancelino. Thanks to all three of you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having us and for supporting this important piece of legislation.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. Much appreciated.
Hundreds of U.S. companies teaming up to ask President Biden.
Change.
So pulling away from an officer would be one example of active resistance. Just muscle rigidity, refusing to let an officer pull your hands away from your body would be another example.
Okay. So there are, like all things, sort of a spectrum of active resistance, active aggression, or passive resistance, right? There's a spectrum of it, right?
Yes.
And during the course of the restraint of Mr. Floyd, do you continue to see Mr. Floyd actively resist to some degree?
Yes, he was struggling.
And how would you describe that within the spectrum of active resistance?
He's a very strong individual, so a lot of that has to do with individual capability. So he was still struggling the efforts of the three officers to control him.
A reasonable officer, in terms of making a decision to keep someone in a prone restraint, can take into consideration the actions that occurred immediately before.
Rephrase, sustain.
Is it possible for a reasonable police officer to, I'll rephrase, I'm sorry. Is the decision to use force or a restraint technique a spectrum similar?
Yes.
And officers are trained to assess the risk.
Yes.
That's preliminary, overruled.
And the threat.
Yes.
Those were some questions you were asked about.
They were.
I think when I got here, the doors were open, so they're involved, but I don't. So, is he on his sentence? Are you still red? Still red? Yeah.
Have a great evening, folks.
Tonight, the major vaccine news. Why did the government pause the use of Johnson & Johnson's COVID shot? And the questions about what caused the rare but dangerous blood clots. The dramatic action by the CDC and FDA after 6 women got sick. 1 dies. Tonight, we asked Dr. Anthony Fauci for answers. Is the J&J shot safe? And what symptoms to be on the lookout for? The charges and the resignations. Tonight, the fallout after Daunte Wright is shot dead by police. Why the police chief just resigned, and could the 26-year veteran officer who shot Wright face imminent charges? Breaking news, leaving Afghanistan. President Biden to announce an end to America's longest war, pulling all U.S. troops out by the 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks. The Chauvin trial. The defense begins its case, but the big question tonight, will the former officer take the stand? Lying in honor. A widow's pain. The emotional tribute to Capitol Police Officer Billy Evans. What the president told the officer's family. Break in the case. A father and son arrested in the disappearance of Kristen Smart, who went missing a quarter of a century ago. Radioactive release inside the Japanese plan to dump contaminated water from the wrecked Fukushima nuclear plant into the Pacific Ocean. And heroic rescue. When a car flipped in a canal, the life-saving decision with no time to spare.
This is the CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell, reporting from the nation's capital.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. We are going to begin with what could be an extraordinary setback in the race to vaccinate Americans. Tonight, the FDA and CDC have asked states to temporarily halt giving shots of Johnson & Johnson's single-dose vaccine after 6 women who got the shot developed a rare blood clotting disorder. One of the women died. The FDA says it's pausing use of the shot out of an abundance of caution while it examines any links between clots and the vaccine. It says the review will likely last just a few days. It's also worth noting that more than 7 million people have gotten the J&J vaccine, making cases of the unusual reaction less than 1 in a million. Still, tonight the announcement is alarming for those who've received the Johnson & Johnson shot and further stoking fears among those who are hesitant to get vaccinated at all.
Cases out of nearly 7 million doses already given of this particular vaccine. The news came early today from the CDC and the FDA halting those injections of the Johnson & Johnson single shot at federal sites. At least 48 states tonight are now following suit. Walgreens and CVS halting those shots too. Of course, many people across the country alerted that their appointments have now been canceled. Those pharmacies say they will reschedule. Some locations offering one of the other vaccines from Pfizer or Moderna. At the White House today, Dr. Anthony Fauci defending the pause, saying the CDC did not move too quickly on this and that safety is key. But tonight, some governors are angry this has been halted. And what do you do if you've already had the Johnson & Johnson vaccine? A list of symptoms to be aware of tonight. And what if you've already scheduled an appointment for this particular vaccine? We're going to ask Dr. Jha about all of this in a moment. But first, ABC's Steve Osunsami leads us off from the CDC in Atlanta.
It's the COVID vaccine that promises strong.
On hold.
The J&J vaccine makes up less than 5% of the more than 190 million recorded shots in arms.
Healthy.
Are you concerned about?
Listen, I've had a really interesting life, a very interesting career. I've decided, you know what, I think I'll write a book. I think people might.
This remains being carried by the Joint Color Guard, led by the 2 Sergeant-at-Arms, Tim Blodgett on the left from the House, and Lieutenant General now Sergeant-at-Arms of the Senate, Karen Gibson. This is a very solemn moment, and it's a very chilling effect you can affect. I was there for the last funeral for Officer Stenick, and it has a big effect on the Capitol Police.
Ready, go. Ready, go. Ready, go. Ready,
name I have in 36 minutes when I feel like I just said.
And what he did in the past, and you can't use it for character, but look, jurors don't split hairs like that, right? Clearly the defense can use this to muddy up his character, to demonstrate he's not compliant, to show this is who he is, but don't look at it for that. I think jurors have a difficult time. On the issue of actually how it helps, of course, the defense wants to use this to show a prior history of drug use, a prior history of non-compliance, a prior history of ingestion. He had drugs then, he has drugs now. It cuts both ways though, right? Because if you're the prosecution, the argument is, well, yeah, he did, but he lived then. And yet, he didn't comply, but he lived then. And he didn't ingest drugs then, but he lived. And he lived the month after and the month after. And so I think an oral argument, which comes up at the end for closing, the prosecution can use it for their purpose, and the defense certainly can use it for theirs. It'll be up to the jury and their good minds to determine the weight and value to give it and to determine who it helps and who it hurts.
All right, Joseph Scott Morgan, through the testimony of the paramedic, she says that George Floyd told her he took 7 to 9 Percocets every 20 minutes through a part of that day. Certainly good for the defense. But here's the question is this. Yes, the jury knows he took drugs. Do they have the evidence to say the drugs were the main cause of death? Because that's where they want to go.
I don't necessarily think they do, Mike. I think that the only thing that the defense can really explore, as I previously mentioned, is this idea that perhaps, just perhaps, they could say that he had previously detoxed and he took, took the same level that he had been used to prior to detoxification. I just don't see that happening, though. I don't see how they do that. If I can expand just for a moment, though, Mike, relative to what the defense has to overcome from a medical standpoint. This case is not so much a forensic case, like I teach at Jacksonville State University, forensics. This is more of a clinical medicine case, Mike, and the absolute huge collection of experts that they have all got topped off yesterday with the testimony of Dr. Rich, and this is bookended by, he took us through all of these steps relative to the emergency medical people, to the emergency room, to obviously Dr. Tobin, and then we have the toxicology and the autopsy findings. And Dr. Rich kind of put an exclamation point on this, didn't he? All the people in the jury might not understand all the rest of this science, but they do understand the heart. They understand how important it is, and that his heart stopped beating. And Dr. Rich, as a clinician, he really brought this around, and it's going to be very difficult for the defense to mitigate this.
Got it. All right, we'll see where they go with those experts. And let's key in on that other body camera footage. And this is from Peter Chang, a Minneapolis Park police officer, 5th officer on the scene. New perspective here, so let's watch a little bit of it and we'll talk about it.
October 14th? 73. Man, I got shot last on the same place, man. George Floyd.
Can you watch that car?
Okay.
Damn, he still won't get in the car. Just sit down, dude.
But again, this is a different perspective, though. Misty Maris, we watched, I think, 23 minutes of this. Was there a payoff for the defense or not?
Look, I think that the payoff for the defense is going to go to this hostile crowd theory. And again, all of these theories get submitted to the jury, and the jury makes a determination about whether or not they're believable and puts whatever weight they believe should be put on this particular video testimony. I think from a defense perspective, it's valuable to get in this perspective of Officer Yang, who says that he's concerned about the crowd, that a crowd is a factor. We heard that from other defense witnesses. The crowd is a factor a police officer takes into consideration under the circumstances. We look at the totality of the circumstances. I also, from a defense perspective, part of the argument is that the crowd was becoming bigger and louder. The other part is that crowds are unpredictable and can escalate very quickly into something that we might not be seeing on the tape, but to look at Chauvin's mindset and Chauvin's perspective and Chauvin's intent is critical to the defense case. So, look, I didn't know there was another angle of the video. I think the defense got what they needed out of it. Whether or not the jury buys The hostile crowd argument is another story.
Yeah, it is. Because I'll say this, if we're going to watch 23 minutes of body camera footage and your point is an angry crowd, let's see it. Yes, he testified to it, but we didn't see it. I mean, you're seeing, and again, the prosecution, they'll use the terminology bystanders, and they'll let everybody know that among the bystanders were children, a 9-year-old and a 61-year-old who we saw break down on the stand. But we'll see how that one plays out. All right, and again, we look at the defense, and what are their key arguments? There are 3 arguments that they are trying to bring home to that jury that could lead to an acquittal. That's
war that cost the U.S. more than 2,000 lives and taxpayers trillions of dollars. CBS's Weijia Jiang has more from the White House.
President Biden's decision to withdraw all American troops from Afghanistan is notable for the deadline he chose, September 11th, the 20th anniversary of the attacks that brought them there in the first place, to track down Osama bin Laden. Mr. Biden had recently hinted that he would make this move, frustrated with a war that is now in its 3rd decade.
We will leave. The question is when we leave, but we're not staying a long time.
The Trump administration made a deal to withdraw the 3,300 troops currently there by May 1st, but the president thought that was too soon. The White House said by September, al-Qaeda would no longer pose a threat to the U.S. homeland. Republicans slammed the decision.
Precipitously withdrawing U.S. forces from Afghanistan is a grave mistake.
Afghan officials, fearful of a resurgent Taliban, told CBS News a civil war was inevitable. Tensions are also rising.
Agree that what we're seeing here is a use of force.
Shown in this picture, that could be a use of force.
Raise your hand.
The jury today also hearing for the first time from an officer who responded to the scene, Peter Chang of the Minneapolis Park Police, who showed up to assist and watched from across the street.
The crowd was becoming more loud and aggressive, a lot of yelling across the street.
Officer Chang's body camera capturing George Floyd sitting on the ground.
Last name? Floyd.
The defense, which has focused on Floyd's drug use before the encounter with police, also calling a woman who was with him at the time, Shawanda Hill, testifying Floyd had nodded off in the car and she tried several times to wake him up when the police arrived.
So he instantly grabbed the wheel, and he was like, please, please don't kill me. Please, please don't shoot me. Don't shoot me. What did I do? Just tell me what I did.
And David, the defense is moving through witnesses quickly here, but at this point, there's no indication that Derek Chauvin would take the stand. David?
All right, Alex Perez in Minneapolis. Alex, thank you. We turn now to news tonight on U.S. troops in Afghanistan. President Biden is set to announce that all U.S. troops will be out of that country by September 11th, the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. Here's our chief global affairs correspondent, Martha Raddatz, tonight.
It will be 20 years in October since the U.S. launched those first airstrikes on al-Qaeda targets in Afghanistan. And tomorrow, President Biden will announce the 2,500 U.S. troops still there will be home by the 9/11 anniversary. President Trump had hoped to bring all the troops home by the start of next month after a tenuous agreement with the Taliban. But some military and civilian officials pushed for a few months longer.
What we decided, we now have new information and we're changing our course. And when people talk about uncharted waters and unprecedented and all these things, I like to use the word extraordinary.
Yeah.
This was an extraordinary situation that we were in, and it called for administration and clinical professionals. Physicians became incredibly important to our decision making. They were the medical professionals. We needed their input. And just like physicians make decisions with the best information they have at a given time,
right,
we were making decisions with the best information we had at a given time, not being given days, weeks, or months to make decisions, but hours. And you need to make them. And if you need to step back from your decision, you've got to be willing to do that.
We're being joined by Bob Sutton, who is the president and CEO of Avera Health. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back with him here on Dakota News Now. Don't go away.
Dick? That could turn into something real, perhaps something more serious on the ground.
but they also single out Russia's cyber threat to the U.S. Of course, we've seen that with the solar winds attack just in the last several months.
Yeah, President Biden spoke with Putin today and proposed a summit in a third country coming up in the next few months. We'll watch that closely. Jim Sciutto, thanks very much for that report. Coming up.
Is the worst she's seen it. Driven, she believes, by a variant thought to be more contagious.
In your experience, how many of these 9 people in this one room will recover or not?
Menos da metade. Menos da metade se recupera.
Less than half will recover. These doctors and nurses just keep doing what they do. They have no other option.
Here in Brazil, there have been more than 3,800 deaths in the last 24 hours. Manuel Bojorquez, CBS News, Sao Paulo.
And there is still much more news ahead on tonight's CBS Evening News. Breaking tonight, new arrests in the
So what's it?
Today is day 1. Toy replica of the Capitol. Would we come back?
Was trying to do. But what about this and the criticism that's coming in about it? Let's bring in our panel. Ben Domenech, publisher of The Federalist, Harold Ford Jr., former Tennessee congressman, CEO of Empowerment and Inclusion Capital, new Fox News contributor, and Byron York, chief political correspondent of the Washington Examiner. Byron, let me start with you. Obviously, people like Lynn Cheney and Congressman Mike Waltz of Florida and others who speak out on military issues say this is the wrong move, and especially to do it on 9/11. But there's a lot of the country that's ready for troops to come home from Afghanistan.
Absolutely. We're nearing 20 years there, and I think President Trump was right to announce a departure from Afghanistan, and I think President Biden is right to announce the departure from Afghanistan.
In your opinion, both the heart disease as well as the history of hypertension and the drugs that were in his system played a role in Mr. Floyd's death?
In my opinion, yes. Joseph Scott Morgan, again, there's the acknowledgement. What more does the defense have to do with that argument?
Well, I don't know that there is too much more that they can do. I think that they're going to have somebody from a medical perspective that's going to get on the stand and say, hey, look, there is no way that the pressure that was applied to Mr. Floyd brought about his death. This is all related to drugs. Just ignore all of the videography and everything else that we've been watching for days and days. I just don't see how they can mitigate this. It's virtually unwinnable at this point for them, I think. And again, are they going to be able to combat this battery of experts, with a toxicologist, with a clinical practitioner, and of course, their own forensic pathologist? I don't know where they're going to get these people from. Is it going to be just like this witness that we had today, going back to what Ariba had said? I don't know. I can't wait to see what happens tomorrow.
The other argument, the second path the defense is trying to go down to get an acquittal is use of force, specific language. And Eric Nelson said it, Darren Porcher, that use of force is not attractive. It's not pretty. But Derek Chauvin was following training. Are you buying that? Do you think the jury is buying that, Darren?
I'm not buying into it, and I think that it's a challenge to accept the jury will buy into it. So, because when we look at the use of force provisions or protocols that are within the Minneapolis Police Department's procedural guidelines, they specifically state that police officers should employ the minimum amount of force necessary. So when we look to former officer Derek Chauvin standing, or I should say holding his knee on George Floyd's neck in excess of 9+ minutes, this is clearly an example of the minimum amount of force not being deployed. And so we also take in consideration the reassessment phase. It's okay for you to start out using force. However, you need to reassess. And there's a point where you need to recede and make the determination that, okay, I've used force to stabilize George Floyd. Therefore, there's no need for me to continue using the same amount of force. We've constantly heard the argument of different theories, but it boils down to the use of force was excessive.
Let's listen to the use of force expert, Barry Broad. This is on direct, and what the defense wanted out of him is that Derek Chauvin's actions were reasonable. Let's listen to that.
Where would you say the first use of force that Mr. Chauvin engaged in occurred?
When he joined Officer King and Lane trying to put Mr. Floyd in the backseat of the patrol car.
And in your view of that use of force, what is your perspective on that?
That Mr. Floyd's level of resistance was objectively reasonable for those officers to do the techniques that they were doing. I felt that that level of resistance exhibited by Mr. Floyd justified the officers in higher levels use of force that they chose not to select.
Misty, do you think anybody on that jury is going to remember that after Mr. Broad was ripped apart in cross-examination?
No, I do not. Nariva made a really good point. Jurors go into the jury room and deliberate using their common sense. They don't leave their common sense at the door when they go in. So after hearing what came out on cross-examination, I just don't see how the jury finds this testimony that happened on direct to be credible. There was just too much that came out on cross to really undercut that testimony. And hey, a lot of it just goes against common sense. Let's not forget about that.
All right. Well, argument number 3, and it's been said throughout, the angry crowd theory, that they were a threat to Derek Chauvin and he could not do his job and care for George Floyd. We'll talk about that coming up.
Treats 16 types of it.
Were videotaped on January 6th walking up to the Capitol in an organized column in tactical gear, then were photographed gathering inside the Capitol. Some Oath Keepers were identified by CNN as appearing to provide security for Trump ally Roger Stone on and around January 6th in Washington.
So there have certainly been examples in the past when Oath Keepers as an organization has prepared for or offered to engage in hostility, if not outright violence, to act as security for someone that they view as embodying American values, but also threatened by the American state.
A dozen members of the Oath Keepers now face conspiracy charges relating to the January 6th attack. Analysts say under so much legal pressure, some members of the group could turn on each other.
It seems like these are people who really enjoyed wearing these uniforms, enjoyed playing and performing this role. But I think it's going to be another thing when they face the combined strength of the U.S. government.
Kenneth Harrelson, Thomas Caldwell, and the other alleged Oath Keepers charged have all pleaded not guilty to conspiracy charges. There is no indication that any of those weapons allegedly stockpiled possibly at that hotel were actually brought into Washington on January 6th. One defense attorney has claimed that that so-called quick reaction force was a precautionary measure against potential violence from Antifa. Wolf?
Frank Todd reporting for us. Thank you very much, and more news right after this.
About new or worsening eye problems, such as eye pain or vision. Bacterial infections in women and men. Urinary tract
wound had opened. I say to you now, our dear Capitol Police Force who protect us, there is no shame in grief and sorrow and shock. We grieve with you. We feel that shock and sorrow with you, and we will heal together with you. To everyone else gathered here, I have 2 things to ask of you. First, if you see an officer today, be like Billy and ask yourself, how can I help? Be like Billy and be a comfort to all who are lost, to all who continue to recover from wounds, seen and unseen, in the wake of these tragedies. And second, I'd ask all of you to keep his memory alive. In the Jewish faith, we say, may their memory be a blessing. A blessing is something we remember and share and speak aloud. Those of you who remember Billy need to speak his name, tell his stories, tell his jokes, even the bad ones, especially the bad ones, to keep his memory alive. To make sure his young children grow up knowing their dad and remembering him as the hero and loving father he was. Today, we are hollow with loss, but one day, Billy's memory will feel like a blessing. If, through all of life's tragedies, Billy could search every moment for that spark of joy, so can we. Rest in peace, William. May your memory be a blessing.
Economists of the 20th century. But as I found out in my new series, The Unauthorized History of Taxes, Friedman played a...
It's worse news in the sense that it seems like the more law enforcement knows about Mr. Gates, the more interested they get in him, the more criminal exposure he has.
If you have symptoms of this bacterial infection.
Coventry window project, and working with them was a walk in the park. They never sacrificed quality, and you can count on them to avoid curb.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a very fluid situation. The prosecution will have you believe that, you know what, this is an exact science. It's not. You have to measure the reasonableness of the officer based upon the totality of the circumstances. And what are those circumstances? The crowd's representing a risk. He's trying to assess that. You have a person who is under his control, who potentially is on substances, who could regain his superhuman strength. He's looking peripherally. He's looking everywhere. It doesn't matter the age of the crowd. It doesn't matter the size of the crowd. It matters that they were angry. And this is an angry crowd that represented a danger. And my client, based upon those circumstances, acted reasonably, responsibly, and within his authority. And not only that, but followed every protocol imaginable. That's where they're going to go. That's the only place they can go. Will it carry the day? Well, that's for another day, and that's for deliberations.
All right, real quick, two-word answer. More or less likely, Joey, Chauvin takes the stand after today?
Still less likely. Too risky.
Darren Forcher, yes or no? Is taking the stand or not?
Yes.
Yes.
He has to.
Anybody change their mind after today? I know, Reba, you say no, right?
Absolutely not.
And Misty?
Will not. Too risky.
Yes or no, Misty?
I think after the science, maybe yes.
Maybe yes. Joseph Scott Morgan, real quick, yes or no?
No way.
No
He's
way.
dragging his past around like an anchor. I don't see it happening.
All right, there you have it. Again, our thanks to our great panel. The next hour of HLN's Cup.
Tonight, the urgent alert, the CDC and FDA recommending a pause on the Johnson & Johnson COVID vaccine after rare reports of blood clots. Appointments for the one-shot vaccine canceled in all 50 states after 6 women developed blood clots, one of them dying. Our exclusive with a recipient in the hospital, the symptoms she experienced. What does it mean if you're among the nearly 7 million who've received the J&J vaccine? And how far could it set back the race to vaccinate? Dr. Fauci is here answering our questions. The police chief and the officer who fatally shot Daunte Wright resigning a day after the release of the body cam and a second night of violence. Will that officer face charges? What we've learned. Derek Chauvin's defense calling its first witnesses after the prosecution rests. Chauvin's attorney showing body cam of George Floyd's previous arrest. And the friend in Floyd's SUV speaking publicly for the first time. President Biden set to announce the full withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan, why the deadline he chose is so symbolic. And the officer honored in the Capitol, he died protecting the powerful ceremony and the moment between the president and the fallen hero's 7-year-old daughter.
This is NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
Good evening, everyone. The race to vaccinate Americans against COVID-19 hit a gut check moment today, one concerning enough to cause federal health authorities to call for a pause in using shots made by Johnson & Johnson. That's because 6 women who received the single-dose shots later developed blood clots. One woman died. The FDA wants a pause now to investigate any potential links to the shots. Here's what we know. The cases are extremely rare. 6 out of nearly 7 million J&J vaccinations given. U.S. officials say they have ordered enough of the other 2 vaccines to keep up the current pace of vaccinations. Tonight, more than 122 million Americans have received at least 1 dose of COVID vaccines. In a few minutes, my conversation with Dr. Fauci about the news and what you should know. But first, late details from Miguel Almaguer.
After today's stunning announcement.
Into one. Explain all that when you step out of the car. Daunte, and then they asked him to put the phone down. Daunte put the phone down. I heard some scruffling. He got out of the car, and I could hear the police officers and scruffling with him.
We're with you.
Then I heard the police officer ask them to hang up the phone. They hung up the phone.
Wright's mother telling reporters she still has been given no explanation as to what happened, and of course facing her great loss. And police say they pulled Wright for expired tags, not air fresheners. They said they then realized there was an outstanding warrant for his arrest when they ran his name in their system. Wright's answers, the family deserves answers for this awful tragedy. It is a sentiment echoed by the former President Barack Obama and Michelle Obama, who wrote, quote, "The fact that this could happen even as the city of Minneapolis is going through the trial of Derek Chauvin and reliving the heart-wrenching murder of George Floyd indicates not just how important it is to conduct a full and transparent investigation, but also just how badly we need to reimagine policing and public safety in this country." Adrienne Broadus is out front live in Brooklyn Center. And Adrienne, what is the latest where you are right now?
Mood has shifted, but this group of protesters behind me are still saying his name. Right, and despite that officer's resignation, many in this group say they want the officer who shot a 20-year-old father criminally fired. They say they cannot unsee what they've seen, and they're talking about that graphic video we're about to share with you. The officer who police say accidentally shot and killed 20-year-old Daunte Wright has resigned. Kim Potter, a 26-year veteran of the Brooklyn Center police force, is seen on body cam footage firing her gun during a traffic stop Sunday. In her resignation letter, Potter writes, quote, "I believe that it is in the best interest of the community, the department, and my fellow officers if I resign immediately." The Brooklyn Center Police Chief Tim Gannett has also resigned. How did these resignations come about? They catch you by surprise?
Yes. I cannot speak to that either.
Brooklyn Center's mayor says the resignations are just the beginning and has asked the governor for the state's attorney general to prosecute the case.
We understand that the sensitivities revolving around this case requires that the attorney general steps in and prosecutes this case.
Speaking emotionally today, Daunte Wright's mother explains what she heard when she was talking to her son in the last moments of his life.
The day that I got the phone call from my son 2 days ago at 1:47 was the worst day of my life. She pointed the phone towards the driver's seat and my son was laying there, unresponsive. That was the last time that I seen my son. That's the last time I heard from my son, and I have had no explanation since then.
Joined in a bond of pain and sorrow, the families of Wright and George Floyd met for the first time outside of the Hennepin County District Court, shaking hands and expressing condolences. The Wrights family attorney, Jeff Storm, said they are not prepared to say this was an accident.
It's not an accident to take your gun out of the holster. It's not an accident to point your gun. It's not an accident to ignore the fact that what you're holding doesn't weigh the same amount as the taser that you've used in training hundreds of times.
Protests continued for a second straight night outside the police department, leading to about 40 arrests after demonstrators defied a curfew. Police saying some threw bottles, fireworks, and bricks at officers. Meanwhile, Aaron, when I spoke one-on-one with him, I asked him if he is capable, especially right now when the entire world is watching, and he said leadership isn't an individual situation, but it requires a team and the community. Meanwhile, people in this community say they want to see changes, especially after learning none of us here in Brooklyn Center live in the city they serve. Aaron?
Incredible thing. All right, thank you very much. Adrian, I want to go now.
Executive Vice President says vaccinations play an important role in getting back to a new normal.
The more that are vaccinated and protected, the better off we're going to be. So it provides a safety reassurance to both our staff and our students that I think is essential for us for next fall.
In Mitchell, Sarah McDonald, KELO News.
DWU is still making plans for the fall, but right now the university expects to be face-to-face. Any mitigation protocols will be decided as the year progresses.
Grand Falls Casino near Washwood, Iowa, made a big announcement. It's going to be expanding into another community. Its parent company, Elite Casino Resorts, is going to build a $100 million resort at Fauner Park in Grand Island, Nebraska.
Second-degree or even third-degree murder. However, the prosecutor has to look and see what the intent of the police officer was, and would not surprise me if he concludes that it's an involuntary manslaughter type charge, mainly because of her shouting out taser, 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 indicating that was her intent. Now, therefore, it was an accident or negligent act on her part. So that could happen, but on the other hand, the fact that she had the gun out, she pointed the gun, she fired it 3 times, the gun is clearly heavier than the taser, that there can be arguments made that it should be murder, second or third degree. But if you listen to what she had to say, that clearly she was indicating that it was a taser, then one might argue that it's an involuntary manslaughter. It's a tough call for the prosecuting attorney because there's a public sentence for much more heavier than involuntary manslaughter.
Right, and of course, we hear the Wright family attorney, saying, well, she had to, holding a gun, pointing a gun, but clearly from what we heard, taser and then the expletive, and I shot him, she seemed distressed and shocked. That is true. But Mayor Rowland-Blake, let me ask you, because, Brooklyn Center, the mayor is asking the governor for the state's attorney general to prosecute the case. So there's kind of an argument on whether this will stay with the county prosecutor or not. What's the right thing to do here?
I think the right thing to do is to not lose sight of what's really going to bring change in that community. Whether or not the state's attorney does it or the governor steps in, the community really has to come together and work for police reform. There's no reason why, it doesn't matter what the circumstances were, that the level of force was used, whether it was an air freshener or an expired tag, even if there was a warrant. If there's a warrant, you have identified the person. You've identified their address. You have their car. Even if he had gotten away, they knew who they were looking for and they would know where to get him. We have to have a conversation in this country about when is it appropriate to use deadly force, and it was clearly not necessary in this case.
So, Chief McKinnon, will the resignation of the officer and the police chief, who, they of course put out this video very quickly because they wanted people to understand that, they say this was accidental. But when the police chief said it was accidental as well, now also has resigned, right? Clearly under pressure. Does this do anything to help? What do you read into that?
No, I don't think it does anything for the city. But I think we have to go back to what the former President Obama and his wife said. We have to reimagine what's going on in law enforcement. And let's look at this. I'm sure that I and the mayor and others have viewed that shooting countless times. There was a call, taser, taser, taser. But if you look at the video again, you will see that her gun is out in front of her. So she could identify it. That was not the taser. The taser is a yellow thing. And her gun is a dart gun, which is what I carried throughout 5 years. And so, so much has to do who we get into this field of law enforcement, reimagining law enforcement. What kind of people? What's in their mind? I mean, and as the mayor said here, they had the idea. They knew who he was. They had his ID. I mean, so it's a misdemeanor that he was going to be arrested for. But is it worth it to take somebody's life?
Right. But they could have chased him down or gotten him another time. Is the point, as opposed to this escalating at the time. So, John, let me just ask you.
So he looked back and when he seen the man had the gun at the window when we looked back to him. So he instantly grabbed the wheel and he was like, please, please don't kill me. Please, please don't shoot me. Don't shoot me.
Also taking the stand, a Minneapolis Park police officer detained Hill while other officers restrained Floyd. The defense played video from his body camera and he testified about the crowd of bystanders.
Very aggressive. Aggressive towards officers, yes.
Then the defense called its own use of force expert.
I felt that Derek Chauvin was justified and was acting with objective reasonableness.
The prosecution pushed back.
In this moment, was this crowd a threatening crowd?
No.
The defense doesn't have to have a great case. The prosecution does. Because the prosecution needs a unanimous verdict to convict, but the defense only needs one stubborn juror to lead to a hung jury.
Outside the courthouse, Floyd's family stood shoulder to shoulder with the family of Daunte Wright.
Police officers are killing us, and we are being murdered at a rate that I never thought I could imagine.
It is not clear exactly how many witnesses the defense will call, but the judge has told the jury that he expects closing arguments on Monday, Lester.
All right, Gabe Gutierrez tonight, thank you. It's America's longest war, and tonight it appears U.S. troops are about to head home from Afghanistan, but not by the May 1st deadline that former President Trump had set. Instead, President Biden is set to announce he'll keep U.S. troops there until September 11th. Andrea Mitchell has more.
After 20 years costing 2,400 American lives, officials say the withdrawal will start almost immediately so President Biden can focus on today's threats. But he won't get out by former President Trump's May 1st deadline, which Mr. Biden has acknowledged.
It's going to be hard to meet the May 1 deadline. Just in terms of tactical reasons, it's hard to get those troops out.
The U.S. has 2,500 troops in Afghanistan, plus about 7,000 NATO forces who would also leave. Defense Secretary Austin and Secretary of State Blinken in Europe today briefing allies.
We know that the Taliban will attempt to come back into power, and I hope that we have put some checks and balances in place with the Taliban and with the Afghan government to ensure that that doesn't happen.
Congressional reaction is mixed because the U.S. will be leaving without a Taliban peace deal or guarantees to protect the rights of women. But a senior official says the president believes waiting for that is a recipe for staying in Afghanistan forever. Lester?
Andrea Mitchell tonight, thanks. This evening we want to look at what's driving the record migrant surge we've been watching at the southern border that's left nearly 22,000 children in U.S. custody, a number that keeps soaring. NBC's Ayman Mohideen reports from Guatemala tonight.
The facts, High
24 hours. Just taking the stand, it was pretty much like a relief to me because the narrative was already painted that they wanted to say that my brother was this, he was that, and he was the one that was tortured to death on camera. He was the one that I had to see over and over again murdered on camera. So when I had the opportunity to be able to speak about my brother, the things that he shared with us, how he would interact with our mom, it was a blessing, especially when I think about how he used to pick her up when she became handicapped, and he used to dance with her, and they used to let Al Green play Love and Happiness. It made me melt when I watched them because it was just so unique watching them dance and things like that, the interactions that they had. And for the last 24 hours, I've just been kind
kind of excited, but at the same time, I've been down because I think about what's going on with Daunte and his family, how they're grieving. And I wouldn't want that on any other family. That's why I stand and I support them now.
You talk about Daunte, and I want to ask you about him in a minute, but convicting officers is very, very rare in this country. What do you make of how the trial has gone, and how confident are you in this system of justice?
You know, I'm confident in what we see, what the world witnessed. The world seen my brother's life extinguished in front of all. And I am confident that these officers, they will be convicted, because you have too many protesters all around the world marching nationwide, and everybody is yelling, "I can't breathe," over and over and over again, because people want to see change. They want to see justice, because what happened in the video was wrong. And these police officers, they have to be held accountable, or this will continue to happen over and over again. And you will see Mr. Crump everywhere, all across the world, trying to help these families grieve and get through this process that we shouldn't have.
And Ben, you've been all across the world representing different families. What do you make of the cases presented by the prosecution and the defense, and how much faith do you have that the system this time may deliver justice for your clients?
Well, I believe Keith Ellison, the Attorney General, the first African-American Attorney General of the state of Minnesota, who has a track record as a champion in civil rights, he and his prosecutors are making a very compelling case that Derek Chauvin should be held criminally liable for the killing of George Perry Floyd. But despite what I may think, Floyd's optimism and his faith is rubbing off on me. And so I do believe in my heart that based on this video that has been seen 50 million times on the internet alone, that in my heart, we're going to get a conviction. But America has broken my heart in the past.
There are a lot of people who are feeling heartbroken. Thelonious, I want to ask you, Delano Castile was killed before your brother in Minnesota. Now we have Daunte Wright killed during this trial for this officer. What do you make of this latest killing of Daunte, and how is it making you possibly relive your own trauma?
Oh, man. It was terrible. I woke up in the morning to find out that a young African-American child had passed away. He was still a kid. You know, he didn't come from a broken family. He had a mom, he had a dad, he had everything that you can imagine that a lot of kids grow up in the African-American community we don't have. And just to see how that mom was grieving, it was devastating watching her. It was devastating watching the auntie. The auntie, she really showed what these families are going through, because a lot of these people that you meet, they don't know how to process this information. They don't know how to talk about what's going on. And she was just outspoken, and she was just letting you know who he was, and he still should be here. Just like his name is Daunte Wright, he should still be right here, right now, like his last name. And unfortunately, we have to go through this trouble, and the world is going through this traumatic stage again, but we have to stand with Daunte and his family.
And Ben, I want to come to you. You're representing the family of Daunte Wright, his mother. What can you tell us about that case, whether or not the officer is going to be charged, and what do you make of the fact that this is, of course, happening during this trial?
I believe that the police officer will be charged with some level of manslaughter when they look at all the evidence, the fact that she was a 26-year police veteran and that she was training people on that day, and there are a lot of suspicions, and they're looking into whether or not they even should have been stopping people for expired license tags, because the DMV had been shut down and backlogged since COVID-19 pandemic. And so there was a directive sent out that don't be stopping people for having expired tags because it may be they haven't been able to get an appointment with the DMV. And so I say that to say, it seems like even for minor traffic events, black people end up dead in some of the most unusual, bizarre ways. I mean, think about George Floyd's brother, the last $20 counterfeit bill. That's a misdemeanor. He could have been given a ticket. They have the discretion to do that. But when it's black people in America, they always engage in doing the most infuriating manner to use excessive force against us. I just see George over the $20. I think about the sergeant in Virginia who was putting his hand out the window being very reasonable. And then I think about Daunte, this young man who probably was not making the best decision, but he didn't put them in harm's way. He was trying to get away from them on a traffic citation, and they shoot and kill him. Right in the midst of the Derek Chauvin trial regarding George Floyd's killing, which I believe is the seminal civil rights case in policing in America's history, that you will have a police officer kill a young man, an unarmed young man who lived 10 miles from where the courthouse.
And Ben Crum, sticking with you, we've talked about black people and policing for a long, long time. What's the disconnect here?
It is about implicit bias. They don't give marginalized minorities the benefit of consideration and professionalism when they pull us. And that's why you see them doing the most versus trying to use their discretion to de-escalate matters. They de-escalated just fine on January 6, 2021 when they white nationalists stormed the Capitol. And so it's not that they can't de-escalate. It's not that they're trained. I believe it's implicit bias training that they don't respect black people in America enough to make sure we get the benefit of our constitutional rights.
Well, thank you so much. Floney's Floyd, condolences to your family. I'm so sorry for your loss. Thanks for joining us. Benjamin Crum, attorney, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And also a ceasefire. We don't have any of that. We have stalemated negotiations. Secondly,
and stopping the vehicle was actually okay. But then we actually get into the idea that they're pretextual though, right? That they're really not the important issues, right? The dangling of the air freshener in and of itself is not a crime. It's not a traffic offense or anything like that. It's the driving while black pretext is what we have going on here, right? And unfortunately, we have this occurring less than 10 miles away from where the Derek Chauvin trial is going on. So we'd like to expect that there would be a criminal prosecution at a minimum of manslaughter of former Officer Kim Potter. But above that and beyond the criminal prosecution, briefly, Joy, I'd like to just touch on this. It's the idea of the abolishing of qualified immunity. The idea that where you can't hit them where it hurts the most, which is your pocket sometimes, where you can't sue for the violation of civil rights because there's this immunity that is afforded to officers that are violating civil rights on a daily basis, that's really something that gives people this carte blanche idea that they can run around as cops and do the wrong thing. And so I think that we need to have a conversation. I know in Minnesota, just a couple of weeks ago, the House passed a new bill. It doesn't have a sister accompaniment yet that allows for a cause of action civilly to sue a cop or a peace officer for the violation of a constitutional right. But that's just, in the backyard of Minnesota. We need to see this across the United States. And so I think that I'd like to see a criminal prosecution, but I'd love to see a civil case because I think that that's where people get motivated, unfortunately, these days, which is money.
Amen. And, Joyce, there are all these sort of compounding things, right? I think that was an important point that, in Virginia, we see Lieutenant Nazario is personally suing the two officers who stopped him. He's claiming a Fourth Amendment violation, and he's suing them individually. I believe he might be suing the department as well. So in some states you can, some states you can't. Some states have these very strong police bills of rights, which afford, obviously the union, the police unions, which is the last really super strong, powerful union in the country. They have such a symbiotic relationship with prosecutors. They have such empathy because they are team members with prosecutors. And there's so very few times when people get prosecuted. And then you look at a place like Brooklyn Center, which is 29% black. It has the second highest percentage of black residents in all cities in Minnesota. It's only one of two cities that are non-majority white. So it's in a particular area, and you see police being told, stop a lot of people. Because, as Katie said, it's just pretextual. Stop a bunch of people, and you may find other crimes, and you may find other things you can find people over. And cities like Ferguson, Missouri, we know notoriously use this for revenue. So black people then become just income generators. We just stop them all until we get enough crimes to charge.
Brooklyn Center reminds me so strongly, Joy, of Ferguson, and it was something that Mayor Elliott said at the press conference today that really grabbed my attention. He made the point that none of their police officers live inside of the city. Yep. And that was what happened in Ferguson, and we all know that that's what really makes it so much easier for these departments to objectify people. Here where you have a lot of white police officers who don't live in the city, as you point out, it can become a profit-making mechanism for the city, and so it goes unchecked for far too long. What this really points out is how critical it is for Joe Biden and Merrick Garland to get their ducks in a row at the Justice Department and get some of their senior level people confirmed by the Senate and in place, because it's clear that DOJ will have a lot of work on its hands going back to the consent decree process that's used to transform entire police departments, to require them to not just pay lip service, but to actually update use of force policies, to train officers, to engage in communities. So, your original question was, will there be a prosecution? I think there'll likely be one here. Federal law, which will be changed if the George Floyd Act passes in the Senate as it has in the House, will make it easier for federal prosecutors to prosecute. Right now it's really difficult because you have to prove a malicious intent to deprive someone of their civil rights, and that's a heavy standard. But the state of Minnesota has shown that it's capable of prosecuting. The problem is that this looks a lot more like a manslaughter, or maybe even some sort of a negligence charge than a murder.
Yeah. I feel like the ghost of sort of Philando Castile, which also happened in that state, is hovering over this. But it would be nice if police departments hired people that were colorblind in the administration of justice and not actually colorblind and can't tell the difference between a yellow taser and a black Glock. Katie and Joyce are going to stick around. Up next, the defense begins its case in the Derek Chauvin.
I don't think it's related. Okay. So I think this car, when I got here, the doors were open, so they're involved, but I don't. So, is he on his pendants? Or, I think it's, okay. Are you still red? Still red? Yeah. Yeah.
If you could let MSP know that MSP is required to go to Market 36 station in the full rest now.
So is it Market 36?
Can you advise the fire department if they're still with you, they need to go to 36 and park with the people on the full rest?
coming up, we're going to bring our experts back to talk about the importance of those tapes. One of them showing potentially a crowd, that's a pillar of the defense, and also this, that 2019 arrest showing potentially George Floyd ingesting drugs as he's confronted by police. How huge of a point is that? We'll talk about it.
What was it like for you? You reunited with Ryan, then Randy.
It is the exact same thing. He could have been doing drugs right as the officers pulled up. It would not make one difference to me. They still, all of them, were on his back. Chauvin still had his knee in his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. The medical examiner still said that was the cause of his death. So anything else they say, drug use and anything about his life, none of that has anything to do with what we're talking about and what the focus should be, and it's Derek Chauvin and his knee on George Floyd's neck.
So when this trial started, we talked about how difficult it was for you, Justin, to explain Floyd's death to your two young children. And you said this is, quote, where change is going to start. Do you still believe that today?
I believe that it can start there, and it should. I mean, not just my children, but this is for black children, white children, I mean, all races of children in the United States. We are one country, and I think that the last few years, and I mean a long few years, maybe 10 years or so, or 15 or more, I don't know, but we have been fractured. And so we have to come back together. And this can be a start. If the right thing happens in Minnesota and everyone tells their kids why this happened and why it could never happen again, then maybe this is a start. The stuff that happened with Daunte Wright the other night is really a setback to that, and it's really disturbing and disgusting. But this can be a start for all of us, and hopefully the people in that jury do the right thing, and we do get it started.
All right, Justin, I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And next, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib says no more policing, incarceration.
Acrylic, but
the exact same thing yet again, and here we go with some more snowflakes falling across parts of northeastern South Dakota tonight. And the good news is that it's really not adding up to anything whatsoever, so no travel concerns for tonight. In Sioux Falls, we've had a lot of cloud cover today, at times a few peaks of sunshine, but we're still at 40 degrees, wind gusting up to 31 miles an hour, wind chill of 30. This is what it looks like in Aberdeen. Again, some flurries still.
It's correct way to boost that. He also may be trying to put pressure on Ukraine, and that's clearly happening. Ukraine is standing up to it, as you have indicated. He may also be trying to put some pressure on the new Biden administration, just to put them to a test early on. But as I say, it's hard to see. There's nothing that would have prompted this from the Ukrainian side.
In trying to unpack again why we are at this moment, I wanted to ask you about what we've been seeing inside Ukraine. Has there been actions from President Zelensky there that could also have provoked President Putin to take this kind of escalation right now?
President Zelensky has been pushing back against Russian-oriented Ukrainians, and in particular Russian-oriented Ukrainian oligarchs. And he has also pushed back and closed down some Russian TV stations, 3 TV stations that broadcast disinformation from the Kremlin. So he has pushed back. The other thing he has done, President Zelensky has done, made it clear his intent, which is in the Ukrainian constitution, to move toward NATO, toward the European Union, and indeed toward NATO membership. This is troubling, undoubtedly, for the Russians, but this is the sovereign right of a country to make its decisions.
Let me ask you about the U.S. approach to all of this, because for years Ukraine has had unwavering bipartisan support from the U.S. when it comes to that conflict with Russia. That shifted during the Trump administration, right? Did those 4 years help lead to this moment?
It's a very good question. So it shifted to some degree over the past 4 years, but only at the very top of the U.S. administration. It was only at the very top of the Trump administration where there was any question about the support for Ukraine. The State Department and the Defense Department and the National Security Council and the Congress, as you've indicated, on a bipartisan basis, they continued to support Ukraine, and it was just this weird dichotomy between most of the government and the very top. So yes, that did confuse people, and that could have left some question in people's mind, whether it was in Ukraine or in Russia, as to how firmly the United States would support. I think the new administration has made it clear that they, as you just indicated, unwaveringly support Ukraine's sovereignty.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as the member designated by Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
Scale is enormous, and of course, if I
may go back to that, maybe with some conditions or maybe not. But we want to leave that up to the FDA and the CDC to investigate this carefully. So I don't think it was pulling the trigger too quickly.
Your response? Well, look, the reporter asked a really good question, and
he clearly failed at the Laquan McDonald trial. So, I mean, I don't know if his track record was so good. What was really critical about this expert today, Joy, is that he was trying desperately to show in a very clinical way that use of force has to be done, you know, compliant with police procedures, etc. The problem is the defense must assume that the jury's not paying attention, because we heard from the actual guy, Lieutenant Mercel from the Minnesota Police Department, who testified for the prosecution, who said that that restraint technique that Derek Chauvin used is not taught by the Minnesota PD. So we already have the person who's actually in charge of everything, including the chief of police, saying, we don't condone this, like we don't authorize this. And the other critical mistake that was made today by the defense was through this guy, Barry Broad. Broad said, you know what, you have to look at what the reasonable officer was doing, meaning we need to put the jury in the shoes of this officer so this officer can, you know, the jury can feel whether or not and determine whether or not this officer acted reasonably or objectively. Here's the problem, and Joyce would agree with me. As lawyers, is something called the golden rule. You are not allowed to ask the members of the jury to put themselves in the shoes of the party. That's a mistrial, right? So what's critically wrong with this argument that they're doing? If you ask the jurors, any of these 12 jurors, to put themselves in the shoes of Derek Chauvin, none of them are ever going to say that what that cop did was reasonable, objectively, subjectively wasn't reasonable. So that was a major mistake, because none of those jurors are going to say that 9 minutes and 29 seconds on somebody without a pulse is something they would ever do as a reasonable officer. So that was a critical problem.
Let me play one more Barry Broad set. This is him trying to use the terms resting comfortably in any way related to George Floyd.
What part of this is not compliant?
So I see his arm position in the picture that's posted.
Right.
You know, a compliant person would have both their hands in the small of their back and just be resting comfortably, versus like he's still moving around.
Did you say resting comfortably?
Or laying comfortably?
Resting comfortably on the pavement.
Yes.
At this point in time, when he's attempting to breathe by shoving his shoulder into the pavement.
I was describing what the signs of a perfectly compliant person would be.
So attempting to breathe while restrained is being slightly non-compliant?
No.
I'm just going to leave that there for the audience to absorb and move on to Officer Peter Chang. He was the fifth officer, the other officer who was there, because the other piece of the defense case, Joyce, is that he's trying to say, well, the crowd also killed George Floyd because they were mean. So here is the other officers raising the concern about that supposed threat. Take a listen.
And you assumed when you were doing that those four officers were okay over there because there were four of them, correct?
Yes.
And if they had radioed for help, you would have heard it over your radio.
Yes.
And they never radioed for help, did they?
No.
That felt like a strong cross to me, Joyce, because it's true. If they were so menacing, why didn't they call for backup?
The defense puts these witnesses on the stand to try to create reasonable doubt in the mind of at least one juror so they can avoid a guilty verdict. And this was not a successful day for the defense, I don't think. You know, the caveat, Joy, is we can't see the jury. We don't know how they're reacting. It's possible that the defense has identified a juror that they're trying to single out and hope that that juror will hold out against rendering a verdict. But nothing that we heard today was really sufficient. And I'll make an interesting legal point. The parties give the judge their requests for jury instructions. At the end of the trial, the judge will instruct the jury about the law, and the jury is obligated to apply that law And the defense asked for an instruction on expert witnesses, and the instruction that they wanted is a somewhat standard one that essentially tells the jury that they should use their own judgment and that they should use their common sense, and they can reject an expert if it doesn't comport with their common sense. And so going back to Mr. Brood, I think that the defense will regret having asked for an instruction that's that strong. And what the jury saw today was someone whose testimony just was biased. I mean, that's really what it came down to. Didn't comport with the reality that this jury has heard about or has understood through their own common sense. And the day looks like it was a failure for the defense.
Listen, you guys are lawyers, not me, but that's how I looked at.
To the highest standards of accountability. At the same time, we know that folks will keep dying if we don't fully address racial injustice and inequities in our country.
Well, former President and Michelle Obama also spoke out today, releasing a statement that reads in part, "Our hearts are heavy over yet another shooting of a black man, Daunte Wright, at the hands of police." The fact that this could happen even if the city of Minneapolis is going through the trial of Derek Chauvin and reliving the heart-wrenching murder of George Floyd indicates not just how important it is to conduct a full and transparent investigation, but also just how badly we need to reimagine policing and public safety in this country. We'll talk about that tonight with our legal and law enforcement team. We'll also bring you the latest in the Derek Chauvin trial. They won for the defense, but testimony under cross-examination from a key witness that might have been more useful to the prosecution. First up, before we go live to Brooklyn Center, a reminder of what set off this latest chain of events, anger and grieving, namely the moment when a police stop turned fatal for Daunte Wright. It's always a warning. It's tough to watch, no matter where you stand on the issue. Miguel Marquez is in Brooklyn Center for us and joins us now. Miguel, what is the latest on the ground?
There's several hundred protesters who have come out. So John, if you could just sort of give people a look at what's happening here. This is the area near Brooklyn Central Police Department. I want to just give you a second and listen to people as they It is an absolutely stunning scene out here. It's a driving snow, almost a blizzard. People have only shown up in bigger numbers at this point. They marched from the police station in Brooklyn Center down to the federal building, the Department of Justice FBI building, about a block away, and now we're sort of winding through the streets in this neighborhood, and they are going to eventually go back to the Brooklyn Center police station. I can tell you that a ton of extra security showed up today in the form of individuals, big trucks carrying personnel from the National Guard. So they are on alert for this as well. But if I can just say, this has been such a heart-wrenching, moving, sad, angry protest today over the latest killing of a young man at the hands of police. Even if it is an accident, even if the police officer resigned, the anger here is palpable. People are tired of it, and the deaths are just part of what they are concerned with. It's the attitude of policing toward African Americans and people of color generally, and it's sort of everyday occurrences that all of this has brought back, and they are just sick and tired and fed up with it, and this is the result. This is a bit more. And it's a very moving moment here, given that they basically have a blizzard coming down on them here in Minneapolis.
Miguel, have you been hearing much reaction from community members in the wake of the news that the officer, Kim Potter, and the police chief have both resigned, and that we may see a charging decision by tomorrow?
Yeah, look, they're happy that they've resigned, but they'd like to see them fired. Now, there may be many reasons why you just can't fire a police officer given current laws, but those are also things that many of the protesters want to have addressed. They have resigned, but for many, it's not enough. They want them fired, they want them to lose their pension, they want them never to work again, and they want general police change. But you can't have these sort of incidents without some sort of accountability in the system. The Washington County District Attorney, who now has the case for Daunte Wright, he says that he may have charges as early as tomorrow, but he also warns that there is a ton of documentation that he has received. He's trying to work through it all, but thinks that by tomorrow he may have some charges. There's also a move afoot from the mayor of Brooklyn Center and other places to try to have the state step in, the state attorney general step in, and conduct the investigation, possibly return as likely to the Chauvin situation. Anderson?
Miguel Marquez, appreciate it. We'll continue to monitor events there. Joining us now is Jonathan Mason, who mentored Daunte Wright in high school. He now owns a consulting firm that provides cultural competency to teachers in dealing with minority and at-risk youth. Jonathan, thanks so much for being here. I'm so sorry it's under these circumstances. You mentored Daunte when he was in high school. You said you're heartbroken over his death. What was he like?
He was an amazing kid, Anderson. I want to thank you for letting me come on and tell my story. Daunte was such an amazing kid. He had a ray of sunshine that came from him. Everybody looked up to him as far as an individual within the school. He always brought a certain type of joy and spunk to him, and that's what drawn me to him right away. And, you know, me and him kicked it off right away, and I wanted to help him become a basketball player within Minneapolis. So, you know, I fought to get him on the basketball team. We were working on getting his homework done, and we would talk about these type of things. So when I found out, it's crazy, Anderson, that I fight for justice. I've been fighting for justice within Minneapolis, Minnesota for 10 years. And I was at another event for a person who was killed by the St. Paul police, and I was getting calls from my uncles and everybody who was in the general vicinity and said, another boy's been shot. So I rushed over there immediately, not knowing it was Daunte. And I seen his mother, and I was like, oh, she looks familiar. But I was just, you know, saying, how could this happen? You know, no justice, no peace. And who's in charge right now? And then all of the kids from Edison started messaging me and saying, you know, that's Daunte who used to hang out with at the school and mentor and help. And Mason, do you know what's going on? And I was trying to tell him, and it just hit me. And I was like, my heart was in my stomach, and I was like, this is Daunte Wright. And it just made me sick instantly right when I found out.
Had you had conversations with him about police?
Yeah.
I believe we have some transmission issues. See if we can, well, try to get Jonathan Mason back. Perspective now from our legal and law enforcement team, CNN contributor and former FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe, former D.C. Police Chief and Philadelphia Police Commissioner Charles Ramsey, currently teaches at Drexel University as our law enforcement analyst, also CNN senior legal analyst and former federal prosecutor Laura Coates. So Laura, we learned earlier today the Washington County
hospitalization rate and 7-day rate of COVID infections did not rise. They dropped to record lows. You're seeing the data on your screen right now. Cases have continued to plummet in Texas.
Out there, hold on, folks. We have an issue here. We're going to try and sort it out. It may be nothing. We may go back to where we were before, but let's just pause and take a really close look at this. That's what this is all about. And that decision was made purely on a public health and scientific basis by the FDA and the CDC.
So I just want to push on this a little bit to sort of understand the risk calculation here, right? So
you know, there's this phrase abundance of caution, which has become a kind of cliche. It was used today, right? Out of an abundance of caution. And every time I hear that phrase, I think, well, I don't want an abundance of caution. I want the correct amount of caution, right? I mean, we're fighting a deadly pandemic, so it doesn't, you know, it matters how many shots get into arms. You and I.
Matters, or to the extent they are, they fall into the residual exception, because these are people.
Video, you hear the officer saying taser, taser, taser. She clearly thought she was holding a taser, or at least that is what would seem to indicate. And immediately after the shooting, you hear her saying an expletive and saying, with some surprise in her voice, I shot him. Do you think charges will be filed, and if so, what?
Well, you know, I think it's entirely possible, Anderson. Let's remember that the medical examiner's conclusion that Mr. Wright died, death was a homicide, that just simply means it was an intentional killing. It was the result of an intentional act. He doesn't get into whether or not that act was a mistake or whether or not it was reasonable. It's just a medical determination. As far as the police officer goes, there are you know, any number of ways that this could be seen as having been negligent or reckless in terms of her deployment of a pistol instead of the taser. As Laura just mentioned, you know, there's a lot of facts that'll go into that determination, whether or not she had the taser in the right place on her belt, whether or not she complied with her training, things of that nature. But it is certainly possible that the prosecutor and a grand jury could determine that there's probable cause to believe that she may be committed a reckless or negligent homicide.
Chief Ramsey, you spoke about this last night, and I think it bears repeating that in the wake of another case in Oakland in which an officer said they thought they were using their taser and actually was using their gun on somebody, police departments around the country had officers have ordered that their tasers be on the opposite side of where their guns were. Is it clear to you that that was the case, that this officer had her taser where it was supposed to be?
The video that's shown, but there is a flash at one point when she's reaching in the car. If you notice to her right, there's another officer, and you can see yellow. That yellow is the handle of the taser. The taser not only feels different, it looks different, but the coloring of it, you can get it in black, but most departments get the taser in either a bright yellow or a bright green. Again, making the distinction between the two. I've watched that video several times, and it just looks to me like as she's walking toward Mr. Wright, as he's struggling with the officer, you can see both her hands as she reaches in to try to assist, and then her hands disappear. It looks like she reached down and grabbed her weapon. Maybe she thought she had her taser, but when she fired, I don't think it was intentional, but it doesn't matter. The result's the same. And not only that, there was a passenger in the car. If that had been a through-and-through wound, then it would have struck the passenger as well. So there were several tactical errors that were made during the entire stop. There's a whole lot of things that are wrong with this particular situation.
And Lord, the intention of the officer, how much does that matter?
I was going to say, I don't, as a prosecutor, I don't make assumptions of innocence, although there is a presumption of innocence in this country. One of the things you have to do is to assume that even if everything they told you is true, you can equally assume that everything they told you is not true as you're investigating it. And you do have a body of law in Minnesota, as we're seeing, unintentional-based homicide cases, unintentional murder, where you need not intend to actually kill the person, but if you intend to perform the act that leads to the death or causes grave bodily harm, it is considered the same. That's one of the charges, by the way, that Derek Chauvin is facing, the idea of unintentional second-degree murder in this case. So in this instance, this is why I mentioned the statement of the police chief. The prosecutor can obviously weigh that assessment of an accident, but they can also look at this and say, are there other factors involved here that could demonstrate that it was not an accident, that somehow it was an unreasonable assumption or too unreasonable to conclude that the officer was actually holding a taser as opposed to a handgun or vice versa. So all of the steps leading from the time that that officer was behind the vehicle, approached Mr. Wright and intervened into what was going to be a handcuff and possibly a fleeing vehicle. All of that gets factored in. And finally, Anderson, remember, the Supreme Court back in 1985 in a case called Garner talked about how an officer is not entitled to use a certain amount of force or deadly force, obviously, to deal with a fleeing suspect who poses no direct harm to himself, the officers, or others. So that same use of force continuum will have to be contemplated by the prosecution in any evaluation in this case as well.
Andrew, in terms of the prosecutor hoping to have charges or a charging decision on the police officer involved by Wednesday, what goes into that process?
Well, it surprises me that they expect to have some sort of a resolution of that process tomorrow, because typically it takes a little bit longer. In most jurisdictions, any law enforcement shooting has to be presented to the grand jury. So takes some time to get in front of the grand jury, to have relevant witnesses testify, to put whatever information about the incident you want the grand jurors to consider, and then of course the grand jurors vote as to whether or not to return an indictment. So I'm a little surprised that they move that whole process by tomorrow, but I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Chief Ramsey, just lastly, both the chief of police and the officer resigned today. Were you surprised that the chief of police resigned?
Surprised he resigned, but then when I heard the press conference, it was clear that he had lost the confidence of the elected leaders. And once that happens, I mean, being a police chief is tough enough. If you have no political support from your mayor, city manager, or what have you, you may as well step down, because there's no way you're going to survive. So he did what was probably in his best interest at the time. I wasn't surprised the officer resigned. There has to be an enormous amount of pressure on both of them at the time. So, the resignations weren't all that surprising, although I really didn't think the chief would step down as soon. But if I could just, very quickly, resignations and firing of one or two people is not going to make a difference. There's a serious problem in policing right now, and it's systemic in nature. And we have got to address it and stop this believing that fire this guy, fire that guy, charge this one, charge that one is going to make the difference. We have to take a real hard look at policing. I think President Biden is making a mistake by not dealing with this up front, by thinking that Congress is going to do it. Our Congress can't do anything right now.
So as somebody who's been involved in policing discussions, as someone who's been involved in policing most of your life, you think something fundamental needs to change?
Yeah, there's no question in my mind. I mean, but you have to look at the entire criminal justice system. This isn't just a policing problem. It's bigger than just police. But police are as good a place as any to start. But there are a lot of, I was on a conference call with Eric Holder, former AG, and he said something that really stuck with me. And that is, we have to stop saying there's just a few bad apples. If you walk by an orchard, you see a whole lot of apples, bad apples on the ground. At some point, you got to look at the tree and call an arborist or something, because there's something wrong with the tree. It's not just bad apples. And so the majority of people in our profession are good, hardworking people. We've got some folks that have no business being in policing, and we better face it and we better deal with it, or else this is going to happen over and over and over again.
Charles Ramsey, Andrew McKay, Lord Coates, thank you. Coming up next, day one for the defense in the Derek Chauvin trial. Defense experts surprising admission under cross-examination by the prosecution about the force used against George Floyd. And later, there's breaking news that could spell even more trouble for Congressman Matt Gaetz. We'll talk to a New York Times correspondent about her new reporting on Gaetz' friend and what he is telling the feds.
The world around you may seem like an immovable, implacable place.
Mostly for previous infection, maybe you shouldn't take them. Is the government taking that warning seriously now?
Well, I haven't seen any evidence that they're taking it seriously, frankly. And I think that, again, I want to reiterate, as we have with
football camp. I'm Ailey Lancer with your C-Mortgage Direct Midco Minute. Eau Claire is partnering with FCA to host the first Cash Money Youth Skills Camp, which is free and will be held on June 26th. The day will feature NFL coaches, former and current players, and helping the youth with drills before ending the day in a scrimmage.
And, I've seen a lot of kids camp, right?
And over again in this crowd, Chris.
So there's an expectation of charges. We'll see if the prosecutor follows through on his estimation that he may bring charges or not tomorrow.
curfew. What does that mean for the crowd behind you tonight? It's supposed to start in a little under an hour.
Yeah, so there's an 8 p.m. curfew, but there's also been a 10 p.m. curfew set as well. What it means to some of these folks is some folks will leave and others will not. That's exactly what happened last night. That's exactly what's happened in every protest I've ever been in any city. So the bottom line is, how you doing? You're right. The bottom line is that there are folks who are going to say, these are our streets, we have the right to protest, and we're not going anywhere. What you will see as a response to that, if there starts to be things thrown over the fence, if there starts to be water bottles thrown at the officers or at the National Guard, you're going to see a response just like we saw last night, with a line of officers standing and pushing people back, slowly, methodically pushing people out of the way to try to get them away from this large building here that houses the precinct, and pushing them usually all the way back out of the neighborhood and kind of into the streets and beyond. Chris?
Just quickly, and then I'll let you go. And you know the deal. You come back to me whenever you want. You tell me what the situation is. I take your guidance. The idea of the chief resigning and being replaced by someone who said, look, I didn't even know I was going to get this job. I don't have any plan. That idea, and the mayor's office had led us to believe that they were worried about what was going to happen tonight. Have you heard anything there about any different plan for tonight or any planned aggravation of circumstances?
No, nobody has said anything about a plan going forward. What they have said is what they expect to see from this department and what they expect from the mayor as well. They are very, very concerned about this resignation, which, by the way, we should mention, the mayor has said he has not accepted the resignation of the officer, Kim Potter, and that is still an issue that is pending. But they're watching and listening, and I do want to mention this. They definitely are listening to the Derek Chauvin trial as well. They brought up what the defense did today, and I know you're going to talk about that in a bit, so I won't get into all the details. But they were, and I can't think of a better word, pissed about listening to the use of force expert that took the stand in the defense of Derek Chauvin's actions against George Floyd, and you will hear that repeated as well. Everyone here is paying attention to every detail that you can possibly imagine with both of these cases now. This couldn't have happened at a worse time in the sense that people were already concerned, already aggravated, already ready to blow, and this was sort of the cork that has been taken off of a bottle that's been shaken.
Look, it's all understandable, but I have to tell you, I know you know this already, the defense has no burden in a criminal trial. For them to make a decision to put on what they call an affirmative case means they felt they had to. And it was probably the right judgment. Will he take the stand? Derek Chauvin, probably not. As circumstances there change, feel free to come to me. I wish you safety and thank you for doing the job for us. Sarah Seid.
Thank you, Chris.
All right. Let's bring in former Baltimore Deputy Police Commissioner Anthony Barksdale. It's good to see you, sir.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for having me.
And thank you for being with me on the fly last night and once again tonight.
Well, in many cities, sweeping budget cuts, this defund the police movement, they are in full effect. New rules prohibiting, as we reported earlier, police from actually enforcing the law all over the country. Officers are facing harassment, random attacks. Not too long ago, NYPD officers all over New York City, you might remember this, doused, look at this, with buckets and buckets of water, other unknown liquids. And just this week, a group of individuals holding toy pigs surrounding a squad, harassing, taunting the officers inside their squad car. Watch.
What's a pig? That's a gift for you. Get the out the line. And take your way through. Give it up. People don't want to see you here. Get the out. Oh! You put the home and beat your wife. You piece of
Anybody want to sign up to be a police officer? That's how bad it's gotten. Of course, none of this compares to the nearly 100 police officers, that's right, who lost their lives in the line of duty so far this year. How many of their names have you heard in the media? How many times have their names been listed or their cases talked about? Given the life and death situations that police encounter every day, I want them to have the tools, the training they need at their disposal to do a difficult job to protect and serve all of us. The 99% of good cops. Non-lethal weapons, I am a big advocate of. More training, I'm a huge advocate of. It can be a great option. I've stated many times I'm not particularly a big fan of tasers, as they can only be used in close range, close quarter situations. The accuracy is not great. At best, you get 2 shots and only 2 shots. Recently, another non-lethal weapon caught my attention. I bought this weapon. It's from a company called Burner Technologies. I'm just a customer. I own several of their non-lethal weapons that are legal because I have the license in New York, just for full disclosure there too. But I've become a fan of this technology as an option for both homeowners and police officers. They would have another option short of the lethal option of a gun and the training to shoot upper body mass. Look at your screen. You see the Burner HD. It shoots .68 caliber projectiles. It's filled with 2 different pepper sprays, tear gas powder. It dispenses upon impact, rendering the target incapacitated. And for more detail, well, they put out videos. I asked them today for these videos. Look at the effects on fully grown men. The one with tattoos just happens to be a law enforcement officer. Take a look. You decide.
My throat's on fire. Like, it's in my throat, it's in my nose. Man.
So earlier you said that you instantly took the fight away.
Oh, yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Like, if I was an assailant trying to come at somebody, no, I'm good. Like, as soon as it made contact, like, I can just feel, like, the effects of it. As you can see with my face, and I'm burning everywhere. So definitely would rather take a taser than this any day of the week.
A cop makes a mistake, a homeowner makes a mistake, person's not dead. Uncomfortable, sure. Pepper spray, tear gas, yeah, you can see the reaction. Look at the reaction. That's just somebody holding something and it gets in their face and they're ready to throw up. And they can't see and they can't open their eyes, and that would allow somebody an opportunity to apprehend a suspect or flee the scene of a crime. As you can see, the burner gun is a longer range than a taser. It is clearly effective. This might be, I believe it should be, a great tool for law enforcement and for the public. I have purchased those items myself. I own them. One thing that I do know, police need better, more effective, non-lethal options with the training to back it up. Either way, I had to get the special projectile that's New York compliant, because New York doesn't let you own anything for the most part. But anyway, if Democrats really want to reform policing, maybe they should put aside the vitriol, the defunding efforts, start using their brains, get police the tools, the training that they need. But don't expect any reasonable solutions from the left. They really only seem to care about their own twisted narrative.
Specialists involved, and very importantly, they are not treated with the typical blood thinners like heparin that you might give a patient who comes in with a routine clot. Which brings up why this pause was instituted, Rachel. It was not only to investigate a potential connection, but also to give us time to speak to and engage the medical community to help them understand what we were seeing so that they could keep an eye out for similar symptoms that may indicate to us that this was happening in other patients.
So if somebody...
Get it right. And I want to show you what video was shown at the Floyd murder trial today, including one from a Floyd arrest in 2019. Why? Here's a strategy. Did it work? We'll see.
I look for the Well Health Safety Seal at my favorite places.
It means health and safety measures have met rigorous scientific standards. Look for the Well Seal.
Look for the Well Health Safety Seal outside.
You can see that they've taken their position. Move to your this way because there's a car behind you trying to get out. Move to that way. There you go. There you go. All right. So now we wait, Lawrence, and we see how long this takes. Last night, it took a couple of hours before the police moved up about a quarter mile in that direction and cleared out this entire area. There's a big parking lot here behind us. There are a lot of cars that are now trying to get out of the way. This is a strip mall over here. All the buildings, all the retail stores, a beauty salon, a dollar store, a pizza place, they're all boarded up tight tonight because there was a significant amount of looting that happened here over the past couple of nights, but they are all boarded up and completely abandoned at this moment. You can see the fireworks going up over there. Those are just what seem to be just harmless fireworks. But there are certainly projectiles going in across the street into the police compound, and the police clearly have had enough of this, and they are starting a very aggressive push to try and clear this area out. Lawrence?
Ron Allen, thank you very much for that report. We will come back to you throughout the hour as the news develops there. As Ron was saying, Brooklyn Center City Council has tried to take over the situation there yesterday by firing the city manager and granting control over the police department to Mayor Mike Elliott.
I'm hoping that this will help bring some calm to the community. Although, I think ultimately people want justice. They want, full accountability under the law. And so that's what we're going to continue to work for. We have to, make sure that justice is served, justice is done.
Brooklyn Center is a northern suburb of Minneapolis. Daunte Wright was killed just 10 miles away from where a jury completed the 12th day of listening to testimony in the trial of Derek Chauvin in the murder of George Floyd. One of those jurors lives in Brooklyn Center and is now living under a curfew this week in the aftermath of another killing by police. Today, the family of George Floyd stood in solidarity with the family of Daunte Wright. Daunte Wright's mother recounted her phone conversation with Daunte Wright when the police approached his car.
She was crying and screaming, and she said that they shot him. And she pointed the phone towards the driver's seat, and my son was laying there, unresponsive. That was the last time that I seen my son. That's the last time I heard from my son, and I have had no explanation since then.
George Floyd's brother said this.
It's a time for change, and that time is now. Minneapolis, you all can't sweep this under the rug anymore. We're here. And we will fight for justice for this family, just like we're fighting for our brother. Yeah.
Daunte Wright's aunt, Naisha Wright, said this about her nephew.
My nephew was a lovable young man. His smile. Oh, Lord, the most beautiful smile. Y'all took that. My nephew's blood is on y'all hands. Did y'all not see my little great nephew? Did y'all not see that beautiful baby? He is fatherless. Not over a mistake, over murder.
Joining us now, Josie Duffy Rice, president of The Appeal, a website covering the criminal justice system, and Jelani Cobb, staff writer for The New Yorker and professor of journalism at Columbia University. He's an MSNBC political analyst.
Just May 31st last year, after the George Floyd death, and not too far, really 7 miles or so from the pictures we're looking at tonight. Newt, your reaction to these pictures?
Well, I mean, sooner or later, we're going to have to decide that we're not going to tolerate this kind of, basically, everybody talks about the insurrection on January 6th. We've seen wave after wave of local insurrections where people explicitly reject the police, attack the police. In many ways, we have a war on cops that nobody wants to really talk about. And we have a totally one-sided system right now. Sooner or later, the society will demand that we reestablish order, that we reestablish safety, and that we not tolerate people who think they have the right to go out and break the law. And
Sarah Seidner on the scene of more unrest tonight in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota. Sarah, stand by. Be safe. We'll get back to you shortly. I want to get to CNN's Omar Jimenez, also live in Brooklyn Center. Omar, there's a ton of police presence there, and I would imagine that Brooklyn Center, the size, their officers must be from surrounding areas, obviously, and members of the National Guard there, correct?
That's right, Don. And basically what we're at right now, to sort of contextualize this law enforcement response, was that before the Derek Chauvin trial, again separate from this, even began, the mayor of Minneapolis, Daunte Wright, sort of laid out these three phases. Phase one would be sort of when the jury selection was happening there, that lowest level of alert, all the way to level 3, and that would be the highest level, a level they were not prepared to go to until we got to verdict deliberations in that trial. We're not there yet we have now been upgraded to that level 3, which now informs all of those law enforcement partners that make up what's called Operation Safety Net here in Minneapolis, which again is a combination of state patrol, local law enforcement, and more. And we are seeing that come into practice in situations like this, outside the Brooklyn Center Police Department, for example. Right now, we saw the most forceful bit of this when it happened earlier. Now, this is what's left. You have at least one guy standing a half block away from a dark police line silhouetted with their flashing lights with his hands up, a symbol really of what we have seen over the past year since we were in this very part of the country a little close to a year ago, I should say. These are the remnants of the protesters. Just about 10 minutes ago, they were on that block in the streets where those officers are now holding the line. And even though they've been pushed back about a block or so, they still haven't left. They're still standing here wanting to make their presence known, as they have over the past few nights in a row. And the mayor of Brooklyn Center here 2 days ago said that this couldn't have happened at a worse time. Well, in many ways, the attention of people here was already on this issue, and it was very primed to explode in the movements that we've seen over the past few days. They're all booing now because every once in a while, Hennepin County sheriff's officers get on the loudspeaker and tell them to disperse after they've declared it an unlawful assembly, to which everyone starts booing, of course, yelling things back in return. And this is the back and forth that we've really seen over the past few nights. Now, obviously, miles away, we are still in the middle of that Derek Chauvin trial. And when court got out today, the judge in that trial told the jurors, one, to have a good night, but also don't talk to anyone and don't watch the news. And part of that is because he doesn't want the jurors in that trial to see what's going on with this and be influenced or distracted in any way from what's going on there. And it was something the defense attorneys for Chauvin were actually nervous about at points, but the judge felt confident enough in the jurors that they could stay focused on that trial. Different case, but the same set of emotions that have felt all too familiar for people, at least here in the Minneapolis area over the past year ago.
Yeah, different case, but similar circumstances there. Again, a life taken by a police officer. Omar Jimenez reporting live for us from Brooklyn Center in Minnesota, and you can hear the fireworks there. Fireworks are being set off, obviously, by the protesters. Police are using flashbangs to get them to move back, and it appears that it has been pretty successful to get them to move back away from the police station. There are protesters still out there, some of them holding their hands up, others, as Sarah Seidner said, kneeling down, laying down on the ground in the middle of the street for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, the amount of time that George Floyd laid on the street in Minneapolis just last summer. So we're going to continue with our breaking news. We'll follow all the developments coming from Brooklyn Center, Minnesota. We're going to take a very short break, but we'll be back. More of the anger that is spreading as protesters demand justice for Daunte Wright.
When I'm on my hands and knees and I'm digging through
the street, the spray painted names of dozens of people who have died at the hands of police, people who've been victims of police violence. I went out there specifically to look for one thing, and I saw that early this morning there was in red and black spray paint the name of Daunte Wright on that street.
Professor Jelani Cobb and Josie Duffy Rice, thank you both for beginning our discussion of this tonight. We really appreciate it. We're going to go to Cal Perry live in Brooklyn Center, MSNBC's Cal Perry. Cal, what is the situation there now?
Hey, Lawrence, things have jumped into a little bit of a lull. I can show you sort of that front line that Ron Allen was talking about. The police did come out of that compound. They did bring at least one armored vehicle out of that compound. The crowd has really whittled down to a few dozen, maybe 100 people. And again, I was saying this last hour, the people that remain seem pretty set on having a confrontation with police. In the last sort of 10 minutes, we've seen less throwing of bottles. We've seen less sort of response from police. It's sort of a standoff right here where we saw the clashes last night, Lawrence.
And what do we expect to change when the curfew hits at the top of the hour?
That is definitely something the police are going to have to sort of make a ruling on. If this crowd stays quiet, it's hard to imagine that they would sort of run through this crowd like they did last night and cause another confrontation. You can hear they're giving these final warnings to the crowd. This is now the warning from the media, and we've sort of given sliding back as the crowd slides back. One of the concerns that the police are going to have, Lawrence, is folks on these trucks, folks in these vehicles who are blocking the street. And again, what happens is these vehicles sort of pull up. There'll be this sort of hail of these bottles being thrown at police. Police are now moving down the street. Police lines going down the street. But again, as you said, Lawrence, the curfew coming up at the top of the hour. It was 3 hours earlier last night. I think the hope was that not only the time, but also the weather. It's been cold, it's been raining here, would keep people out from coming on the street. And it is, Lawrence, a smaller crowd tonight.
Cal Perry, thank you for that report. We will be coming back to you as the hour continues. And today, just 10 miles from where those protesters are tonight, the defense began presenting its case in the trial of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd. And after 6 witnesses completed their testimony today in the defense of Derek Chauvin, no real defense of Derek Chauvin's conduct emerged from that testimony. Some of the witnesses called by the defense did not want to help the defense, like George Floyd's former girlfriend, who was in the backseat of George Floyd's car when the police approached George Floyd. She testified that when she ran into George Floyd in the Cup Food store, she said he was, quote, happy, normal, talking, and alert. Some of the witnesses appeared neutral on the witness stand, like the retired police officer who was asked to testify about the time he arrested George Floyd in 2019. The arrest was shown on police body cam video. It shows George Floyd complying with police orders and being handcuffed. That was evidence that in no way helped the defense because it showed how cooperative George Floyd could be in that situation. Some witnesses clearly wanted to help the defense, like Minneapolis police officer Peter Chang, who was across the street from Derek Chauvin and the other officers who were crushing George Floyd into the pavement and was never part of that action himself. And so here is how he tried to help the defense.
As Mr. Floyd and the officers were across the street, did you notice any changes in the area?
Yeah, as there was a crowd. And I guess the crowd was becoming more loud and aggressive. A lot of yelling across the street.
Aggressive. He said that to a jury who had already seen multiple videos of the small group of bystanders that did not really constitute a crowd and were never aggressive. The witness who tried to help the defense the most was a self-proclaimed use of force expert from Montana, whose policing experience includes service in the United States Park Police and the Santa Rosa Police Department in California, which has less than 1/3 the number of police officers of the Minneapolis Police Department. Barry Broad offers himself as an expert witness for hire in cases like this. He first offered his services to the prosecution in this case, but they wisely declined to deal with him. But the defense decided to pay him for testimony like this.
Can you just briefly overview your opinions in this particular case?
I felt that Derek Chauvin was justified, was acting with objective reasonableness, following Minneapolis Police Department policy and current standards of law enforcement and his interactions with Mr. Floyd.
A jury has rejected Barry Broad's testimony in another high-profile murder trial of a police officer. Barry Broad testified as a hired witness for the defense in the murder trial of Chicago police officer Jason Van Dyke for the murder of Laquan McDonald. The jury rejected Barry Broad's testimony entirely and convicted Officer Van Dyke of first-degree first-degree murder and aggravated battery. And after the jury last week heard expert medical testimony from Dr. Martin Tobin, who said the fact that someone can speak is not proof that they can breathe, Barry Broad actually said this.
If somebody's saying they can't breathe, it appears to me they're taking full breaths and they're shouting. To me, the layperson, they can breathe.
After testifying under oath that Derek Chauvin did not use deadly force on George Floyd, even though George Floyd died from that force, Barry Broad actually denied under oath that any form of force was used against George Floyd. The jury didn't really need cross-examination to know how false that testimony was, but the prosecution's cross-examination did crush every point Barry Broad was paid to make on the witness stand today.
What you said is that it was unlikely to produce pain, and that's why it wasn't a use of force. You now just said that it could produce pain. And so, regardless of the officer's intent, if this act that we're looking at here in Exhibit 17 could produce pain, would you agree that what we're seeing here is a use of force?
Shown in this picture, that could be a use of force.
Joining us now, Kurt Burkhalter, a criminal law professor.
Here, still not leaving and standing their ground down, and we have seen National Guard and Brooklyn PD use crowd control munitions to try to get control of the crowd, but it's still kind of chaotic scenes right now. You're hearing a lot of fireworks, a lot of loud sounds popping off right now in the background, but still a few hundred out, still here standing their ground right now as we speak.
Yeah, Jorge, the crowd that you can actually make out, is it a diverse crowd? I mean, I see a lot of, Mike said there was some Antifa there that he was able to get to identify themselves as linked to Antifa. But there seem to be a lot of people who are maybe they're not from the local community. It seems like there's a lot of people, maybe they're press or bust in or they're professional activists. It's difficult to say, but I don't know if you can see better than we can.
Yeah, it's been a little bit difficult to say. It has been a mix. We have seen some Antifa flags. We're seeing a mix of Black Lives Matter activists as well, and as well as some locals. And we have some folks that are coming out of town. So it is a mix between all. And they all right now just seem very angry and they are pretty adamant that they're going to stand here and fight the guard. Like I said, we've seen just lots of rounds of tear gas used tonight. And even though some folks have left, there's still a few hundred out still here. Like I said, it's a mix between Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and then you do have those folks that do come out around this time just to cause trouble when potential civil unrest does pop off, just like we're seeing here tonight from the Brooklyn Center in Minneapolis.
And Jorge, the concern has been repeatedly stated that another police precinct in the area could be in jeopardy, and the authorities are just not going to let that happen. I mean, last year was such a colossal embarrassment for Minneapolis to see that third police precinct. I believe it was a third police precinct. My memory serves me correct. Correct me if I'm wrong. That was, never recovered, and it was just abandoned because it was surrounded by so many violent protesters, and they had burned so many of the adjoining nearby structures that we filmed. That was back in August when we were there filming the buildings. In some cases, they were still smoldering. Even a few months later, you could still smell the chemicals and the other components of the structure still smoldering. That's how bad the burn was in that area.
Yeah, so this time around, we are seeing the Police Department, Brooklyn PD, as well as Minnesota State Trooper and the National Guard work hand in hand to protect the police department right behind me. You see a firework just popped off. But the bad thing about this is actually that it leaves all the small businesses in the area very vulnerable. And law enforcement right now is really stretched in. We've seen multiple businesses burned down and looted during this time for the second night in a row. We have heard of reports of some looting tonight as well. But that's basically really the negative thing about protecting the police department is the rest of the city is kind of is unprotected and vulnerable. And right now law enforcement is really spread thin between the National Guard, the state troopers, and the local PD here at the.
Applebee's Irresistibles are
patterns to spider signals and recreated the sounds with the help of math algorithms and computers. Artificial intelligence was used to interpret the spider sounds because spider activities cannot be heard by humans. Researchers are hoping the music can help humans understand the spider's language and form a possible communication link between humans and spiders at some point.
Coming up, Tyler will have one last look at the weather in this 9 o'clock hour when Dakota News Now returns here on Fox Sioux Falls.
Miss your favorite show? Go to fox.com.
In fact, it's a very dangerous moment in American history.
Yeah, and people at some point will, and this is just how it always goes, will take the defense of their family and their property into their own hands. We saw that during the LA riots when store owners stood outside with shotguns and said, no, you won't, you're not going to take this. And you've seen that to some extent in Minneapolis over the past 72 hours, where you do have people saying, the police can't do it, we're going to do it ourselves. And for the most part, they've been able to protect their stores. The ones
is this own form of violating people's First Amendment rights during protests. We are just weeks away from a verdict where an off-duty police officer was beaten by his colleagues during a protest in 2017 in St. Louis. So we have to, again, get away from this old and tired arrest and incarcerate model to one that leads with prevention. Because that's the only thing that's going to keep us from having these situations over and over and over again.
St. Louis Mayor-elect Tashara Jones, thank you very much for joining our discussion tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. We're going to squeeze in a break here. When we come back, we'll have more live coverage from the street in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota. The curfew will be in place officially at the top of this hour. We'll be right back.
Life doesn't stop for
back guaranteed.
I think we can all collectively agree.
Having this talk thousands of miles apart.
Sound on investment. FHA no longer used redlining maps. They were illegal.
That we have relatively control? Or is it the unknown threat posed by the crowd that could go from verbal to trying to interfere with my arrest process in a matter of seconds?
Did you factor that into your analysis of this case?
I did.
How so?
I could see that Officer Chauvin's focus started to move from Mr. Floyd to the crowd. To one point, I think Officer Chauvin felt threatened enough that he withdrew his pepper spray canister and gave verbal commands to the crowd to stay back. So now he's dealing with the bigger threat.
So just to kind of wrap up, could you summarize the final opinions that you have made in this case?
I felt that Officer Chauvin's interactions with Mr. Floyd were following his training, following current practices in policing, and were objectively reasonable.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Mr. Fisher. Sure.
Largely to local minorities. They're not dangerous to the Nancy Pelosi's in a secure neighborhood or to the very rich or to Barack Obama, but they're very dangerous to local poor people and to people of color.
Yeah, well, you see the authorities moving in and some of these pictures on the crowd that will not disperse. And to your point, Newt, in the area right around where George Floyd was killed, there's like a 3 or 4 square block area. It's all blocked off to any regular traffic. And there's basically there's dividers and people sitting at, convention tables, essentially preventing the free flow of people in and out of the area. You have to basically go through some rudimentary screening. And I'm thinking to myself, who's getting rich off this? The neighborhood's not improving because of this giant a situation going on around where George Floyd was killed. I understand there's a memorial there, and that's fine, but I don't know what kind of commerce exists around there at all.
Well, I think one of the things we have to do is eliminate no-go zones, whether it's in Minneapolis or Portland or Seattle. We just have to say flatly, the United States is one country, and we're not going to tolerate local people, in effect, seceding, creating mini countries that they then dominate and control. Again, usually to the disadvantage of people of color.
You need to soften stools, we're all agreed. Number 2.
On their way to get the money.
People here still loud and passionate again, hours after first getting here on scene. Some of the more violent images that we saw in just the past hour and a half or so, police pushing people out, was different from what we saw in the earlier afternoon hours. There were demonstrations of marches, and people were giving speeches and sharing stories. And so people here are expressing what they've been feeling in a variety of ways, and they are doing it over a long period of time. And it's not just tonight, obviously. This is the 3rd night in a row of demonstrations here in Brooklyn Center. And before all of this even happened, law enforcement in this area were ramping up for what they believed was going to be the most stressful part of time, I should say, in this area. And that was the verdict around the Derek Chauvin trial. Yet this happened, and they scrambled some of that same law enforcement, bringing them back up, calling in some of the up to 2,000 National Guard they had here on site to come out and respond to the scene. And this law enforcement response is a combination of the local law enforcement, the state patrol, and of course the National Guard that has been called out to respond as well.
All right, Omar Jimenez on the scene, stand by. We're coming up on the top of the hour. It will be 11 p.m. Eastern Time, 10 o'clock Central, and that is when a curfew goes into effect. We're back in just 2 minutes with our crews live from Brooklyn Center, Minnesota. Don't go anywhere.
Conversations. Sometimes you...
And we'll continue to provide those updates. But right now, I would say there's now probably less than 100 people still out here right now.
There are sporadic reports, Jorge, of other problems in the Minneapolis area as this is unfolding. We don't have pictures of them, but again, when you have that much of a police presence in one part of the city, curfew or no curfew, there's only so much ground that you can cover. You can't cover it all, and you certainly can't protect every business, which leads back to Newt's point that until law enforcement gets serious and puts down what is ultimately an insurrection against enforcing the rule of law, unless they start doing that, then you're just going to keep getting more of it. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Jorge, if this trial of Derek Chauvin doesn't go the way they want it to go, what happens then?
Well, I think we're going to really just, see a repeat of last summer where, these groups start to attack every major city, and it seems almost every big city goes into flames. Every small business suffers, especially the minority business, the black and brown businesses get hurt when this stuff happens. They get their stuff destroyed, and it's a really sad thing for these communities. And even at this scene right now, right here, just in front of the police department, are a bunch of apartments and families. You can actually see a lot of families and their kids actually looking out the window while all this chaotic scenes is happening right now. But I think one thing that hopefully is coming is that the Minnesota PD and the state troopers, they have learned a lesson from last year, and hopefully they...
Well, we got to go, Jorge. Thank you for your reports tonight.
Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, we really appreciate it. MSNBC's breaking news coverage continues now with the 11th hour with Brian Williams. That's right now.
And indeed, good evening once again. While this happens to be day 84 of the Biden administration, we begin yet again this evening in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, just north of Minneapolis, where it is now 10 p.m. local time and that curfew has just gone into effect. Protesters remain on the streets, however, for a third night as anger and outrage are growing after the deadly police shooting of 20-year-old Daunte Wright. Wright was shot and killed on Sunday when police pulled his car over and tried to arrest him on an outstanding misdemeanor warrant. Kim Potter, the 26-year veteran officer who fired that single fatal shot, has resigned, as has Brooklyn Center Police Chief Tim Gannon. He called the shooting accidental after viewing Potter's body camera video, which he said indicates she thought she was deploying a taser and instead fired one shot with, of course, her highly lethal and vastly different 9mm service weapon. That single shot, fatal, and now a 20-year-old, Daunte Wright, isn't alive anymore. This afternoon, the mayor of Brooklyn Center reacted to Officer Potter's decision to resign.
The officer stepping down has the effect, I think, of speaking to one of the things that the community, that folks who have been out here protesting have been calling for, and that is that the officer should be relieved of her duties. This case needs to be given to, appointed to the Attorney General, right. And so I am calling on the governor to exercise his authority and to move this case from Washington County to the jurisdiction of the Attorney General.
Daunte Wright's family also spoke out this afternoon as members of George Floyd's family looked on. Wright's mother described seeing and speaking to him before he was shot.
That was the last time that I seen my son. That's the last time I heard from my son, and I have had no explanation since then.
My nephew was a lovable young man. His smile. Oh, Lord, the most beautiful smile. Y'all took that.
Again, this is all unfolding about 10 miles north of the city center of Minneapolis, where former police officer Derek Chauvin is, of course, on trial for the murder of George Floyd. This morning, the prosecution rested its case after 11 days of testimony, 38 different witnesses. The defense then began laying out their case. Among the witnesses, a use of force expert who defended Chauvin's actions.
I felt that Derek Chauvin was justified and was acting with objective reasonableness, following Minneapolis Police Department policy and current standards of law enforcement in his interactions with Mr. Floyd.
The defense also introduced video of Floyd's arrest in May 2019. It happened in North Minneapolis, and called the EMT who responded to that scene.
Were you able to learn that Mr. Floyd had consumed some narcotics that day?
Yes.
What did he tell you specifically about what narcotics he had taken and when he had taken them?
He told me that he had been taking multiple, like every 20 minutes, and it was a I don't remember if it was Oxy or Percocet, but it was a opioid-based.
Also tonight, there are new developments concerning the federal sex trafficking investigation into Trump acolyte and Florida Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz. The New York Times reports that indicted former Gaetz associate Joel Greenberg, he's cooperating with the feds and, quote, has been providing investigators with information since last year about an array of topics, including Mr. Gaetz' activities. Joel Greenberg disclosed to investigators that he and Mr. Gaetz had encounters with women who were given cash or gifts in exchange for sex. One of the authors of this Times story tonight, Katie,
with them. That is going to be used as a makeshift shield. When the less lethal munitions come out, they like to kneel, put that in front of them. We saw that last night. They'll hold that shield up and try to deflect the rubber bullets, pepper balls, and things of that nature. So you got someone on the megaphone here. And what you really see at this stage of the demonstration, there's a lot of people who want to hold their ground, be defiant for as long as they can, and that's exactly what you're looking at right now. You got one guy in the foreground there dancing up in front of the police lines, and this is sort of the game that is played out, Shannon.
And Mike, let me ask if you can hear me. I know we've had 3 nights of this, and there have been different groups, different people, different incidents. There have been, separate from the people who say they're trying to have a peaceful protest, there are those who have leveraged this and tried to use the chaos to do other things like loot and cause trouble. What are you seeing tonight? Is it primarily where you're at a peaceful protest? Have there been other issues? And I know you're in one location, and some of these are different locations. But is that the main thrust of what you're seeing tonight is primarily these peaceful protests? People who probably are now violating curfew. They don't want to go home, but they're not engaging in something beyond that.
Well, I think you'd have to define that, because I have seen a lot of rocks and bottles coming up over the crowd, pelting the cops in the riot gear. You can make the argument that by showing up, then they create a friction point, and that's where you see the line in the sand, and that's where you start having the clashes simply because the police are there in the riot gear. That's going to be one argument. The other argument, of course, is that they've got to protect that police headquarters. They can't have a repeat of what we saw with the 3rd Precinct almost a year ago. So when you start talking about peaceful protest, everyone who's ever been arrested at a protest has said that they were a peaceful protester. We see that time and time again. And you do have a lot of people who are out here who are very sincere and very angry over what happened in this case. The different arguments. They don't believe the argument or the police narrative that Daunte Wright was pulled over for an expired tag. But you have a lot of people who show up to express themselves, to express their anger, and you do have people who show up here with the helmets, with the black hoods, with the backpacks. We saw them with the leaf blowers. You see them with some of the makeshift weaponry, if you will, in terms of the shields. I've seen people with the devices that they could use to break glass. It wouldn't really have another purpose. And I've seen people with sidearms in the crowd tonight. So you say, are there peaceful protesters? Of course there are peaceful protesters. Are there sincere people out here demonstrating? Of course there are. Were people out looting last night? Yes, there were. And the people were out looting the night before. So it's always a mixed bag, Shannon.
Enforcement across the state. That's what it's going to take. It's going to take local, county, state, and federal jurisdictions to come together to say, hey, let's really change the culture of policing.
The investigation of Wright's death remains active this evening.
Testimony continued in the George Floyd murder trial today. The defense's use of force expert, Barry Broad, testifying that former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin's actions were justified due to what he says was George Floyd's continued resistance. Former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin is charged with murder and manslaughter in connection with Floyd's death. You can follow all of the updates from the trial by going to our website, dakotanewsnow.com, and searching the word Chauvin. Nearly 3 decades later, the death of 19-year-old Tammy Haas still looms large over the Yankton community.
Tonight, there's a renewed effort to solve her case. The FBI is offering $15,000 for information on Haas's death. 19 years old. In 1992. An autopsy revealed she died of a broken neck. Investigators suspected foul play. Her boyfriend at the time was charged with manslaughter in her death, but was found not guilty by a jury. Her friends and family are not giving up hope on finding out the truth.
I just hope and pray that it can have a positive result and that there's somebody out there that truly will want to come forward, whether it's for the reward or if it's just for doing the right thing.
If you have any information, you can contact the FBI or the Yankton Police Department at the phone numbers on your screen. Tips can also be submitted online to tips.fbi.gov.
It is election night in several South Dakota communities.
Brookings voters elected a new...
told the jurors when he dismissed them, of course today, the first day that the defense could present its case, he told them to go home, don't talk to anyone, and don't watch the news. He doesn't want the jurors in that trial to be influenced by what's happening in their very own communities right now as they try to stay fair and impartial in that case. And the defense attorney in that trial brought this up as a concern yesterday after the first night of protest that we saw. basically saying that he worries that jurors will be put in a position where they only vote guilty because of fear of what will happen in the community. That's why the defense attorney wanted the jury to be sequestered now versus when they're supposed to be sequestered after closing arguments and as they go through deliberations. The judge ruled that he trusts the jurors enough to be able to separate the cases, but of course the linkage between the two is the same set of emotions, the same set of pain, that we now see another family joins this unwantable fraternity and sorority of families stricken by tragic violence at the hands of police officers. And so that is going to be a factor day in and day out in that trial, especially when you look at the proceedings that happen here, where we go into curfews every night, where this becomes much harder to avoid, even if you are a juror trying to avoid all media. So that could be an added to some of the demonstrations that we see, again, adding to what has already been a tense time here in the Minneapolis area.
Omar, at the height of this, how many people would you think were out there? A couple hundred, and now?
I would say it was a couple hundred at the peak of this, and right now there are about 30 at these front lines, maybe 30 or 40 people, if that. That's being pretty generous. And so, again, these numbers are extremely diminished, and even in the minutes after the curfew was put into effect, these numbers were much more diminished. Instead of the big crowds shaking these fences, you've got a few standing here with their hands up, you've got others maybe even dancing at the front line as well. These, the chants are, of course, way less than they were before. There are no microphones booming. This is just voices being heard, and there are no stories being told. There are no songs. These are the people that want to send a message that they're not going anywhere, and this is what we are seeing in the snow, in the late night cold of an April in Minnesota here. These people aren't going anywhere, and I have a feeling over the course of this week, and as we sort of blend into what's happening in the Chauvin trial and deliberations there, I don't think they're going to go anywhere as those demonstrations begin to combine.
Yeah.